My brother smirked across the family dinner table and said I did not deserve to carry our last name. My mother nodded in agreement. My father stared at his plate. Everyone waited for me to fall apart. Then my grandfather slowly stood up and said, "Then she will carry mine and everything that comes with it." My brother's smile vanished instantly as he begged our grandfather not to do this to him. "My name is Camille. I am 35 years old, and somehow I am still healing from the deep wounds my family inflicted on me over the years. As a successful crisis public relations and brand strategist, I managed to escape their toxic environment, but I maintained occasional contact out of a misplaced sense of obligation. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family members who severely underestimated your worth and tried to tear you down. Growing up in the affluent enclaves of Atlanta, Georgia, specifically in the wealthy neighborhoods of Buckhead and Alpharetta, meant everything was about legacy image and high society politics. To the outside world, the Sterling family represented the pinnacle of Black excellence. My father, Elias, was a highly regarded community leader and the head pastor of a massive megachurch with a congregation of thousands. My mother, Vivian, was an image-obsessed socialite who sat on the boards of multiple charities and treated Atlanta society like her own personal chessboard. They projected a flawless image of grace, faith, and prosperity. But inside our sprawling mansion, emotional coldness and rigid hierarchies dictated every interaction. The family dynamics were crystal clear from the moment I was old enough to understand them. My older brother Julian was the golden child. He was the legacy son born to inherit the massive logistics and supply chain empire my grandfather had built from scratch. Julian could do no wrong. His failures were swept under the rug, and his mediocre achievements were celebrated as strokes of pure genius. I, on the other hand, was the disappointment simply because I refused to play the submissive, quiet role they assigned to me. I had declined to work at the family firm, choosing instead to build my own path. In their eyes, this made me a rebellious outsider. The climax of this lifelong tension happened last night in the private VIP dining room of Chop's Lobster Bar, one of the most exclusive steakhouses in Buckhead. The room smelled of aged leather, expensive bourbon, and the suffocating weight of my family's expectations. We were supposed to be having a celebratory dinner for my parents' 40th wedding anniversary. The long mahogany table was littered with the remnants of a sprawling feast. Wagyu tomahawk steaks, butter poached lobster tails, and empty bottles of imported Cabernet that cost more than a mortgage payment. For 2 hours I had endured the usual thinly veiled insults about my life choices. I kept my responses polite, and my face a mask of pleasant indifference, exactly as my crisis management training had taught me. Then the waiter entered the private room carrying a thick black leather folder. He stepped respectfully toward my father at the head of the table, but Julian intercepted him. My brother snatched the folder from the waiter's hand, flipped it open, and let his eyes scan the numbers. A nasty, familiar smirk spread across his face. It was the same cruel smile he used when we were children, right before he broke one of my toys and blamed it on me. Without a word of warning, Julian stood up, leaned across the wide table, and threw the heavy leather-bound bill directly at my chest. It hit my silk blouse hard and landed with a loud thud on my dessert plate, splashing a drop of raspberry sauce onto the pristine white tablecloth. The total sitting right there in bold black ink was $10,240. I looked up at my brother, my heart maintaining a steady, calm rhythm. Julian sneered at me, his voice booming so loudly it practically rattled the crystal chandeliers above us. "Pay up, Camille," he demanded, crossing his arms over his tailored suit. "Since you are just a spinster freelancer who refuses to join the family business, consider this paying your dues. It is the least you can do for being a constant embarrassment to the Sterling legacy." The room went dead silent. The only sound was the faint clinking of ice in someone's glass. That is when Chloe chimed in. Chloe was Julian's white wife, a woman who had married into our legacy, black wealth, and quickly mastered the art of weaponizing Southern microaggressions. She placed a perfectly manicured hand over her heart, her blue eyes wide with fake calculated sympathy. "Bless your heart, Camille," she said, her drawl thick and dripping with absolute condescension. Julian is just so stressed managing the actual family empire while you play around on your little laptop all day. We know things must be tight for you right now, doing odd jobs on the internet. If you cannot afford it, maybe we can help you set up a payment plan, sweetie. Her words were designed to cut, carefully constructed to remind me of my place at the absolute bottom of the family hierarchy. In this family, if you were not running the logistics company or standing behind a pulpit, your career was considered a cute hobby. It did not matter that I had graduated at the top of my class. It did not matter that I had spent the last 10 years building a fierce reputation as a brilliant brand strategist. To them, my independence was a direct insult to their control. They needed me to be the struggling single 35-year-old failure so that Julian could shine brighter by comparison. Julian, who had secretly driven 3 of the family company's regional branches into the ground and relied on our father to bail him out of every bad investment he ever made. I shifted my gaze toward my parents, waiting for the inevitable defense that I knew would never come. My father, the great Pastor Elias, simply stared straight ahead, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. He refused to look at me, actively endorsing my public humiliation with his silence. He was a man who preached about love, grace, and family unity every Sunday morning to thousands of devoted followers, but he reserved absolutely none of that grace for his own daughter, my mother. Vivian elegantly dabbed her lips with a linen napkin, not even bothering to hide her satisfaction. She took a slow, deliberate sip of her wine. Her silence spoke volumes. I was supposed to break. I was supposed to cry, to beg, to feel the crushing weight of their disapproval, and finally surrender my independence. They wanted me to completely fall apart, to admit defeat, and to come crawling back to the family firm begging for a meaningless title just to secure their conditional love. I slowly reached for my glass of sparkling water, took a measured sip, and set it down quietly. I picked up the leather folder from my plate, brushing off a stray crumb. I did not shed a single tear. I did not raise my voice. I simply reached into my designer handbag, a custom piece that cost more than Chloe's entire wedding registry, and pulled out a solid titanium Centurion American Express card. The heavy black metal caught the dim light of the dining room as I tossed it casually onto the bill. I looked directly at my sister-in-law, letting a cool, razor-sharp smile form on my lips. "Thank you for your immense concern about my little laptop, Chloe," I said, my voice carrying the smooth, unwavering authority of a woman who knew exactly what her time and energy were worth. "But you really do not need to worry about setting up a payment plan for me. In fact, that little laptop you just mentioned secured a 7-figure crisis management contract with an international tech conglomerate just this morning. So I think I can handle covering the appetizers for my brother, considering he is currently defaulting on half of his corporate loans." Chloe's mouth dropped open, the fake southern sweetness evaporating instantly from her face, leaving behind a mask of pure shock. The blood drained completely from Julian's cheeks. He stared at the black titanium card sitting on the table, realizing in real time that his grand theatrical humiliation tactic had just backfired spectacularly. I had just dismantled his entire narrative of my failure with a single undeniable piece of metal. Furious that I had not only survived his attack, but completely overpowered it, Julian slammed both his hands down on the mahogany table. His chair screeched backward against the hardwood floor as he stood up hastily, his face twisted in absolute uncontrollable rage. He pointed a shaking finger directly at my face, abandoning all pretense of being the composed, sophisticated heir to the Sterling Empire. "You do not deserve to carry our last name," he spat, his voice shaking with a toxic venom that filled the entire room. "You are a stain on this family, Camille. A complete and utter stain." The echo of Julian screaming that I was a stain on the family bounced off the polished mahogany walls of the private dining room. Then came the dead, heavy silence. Nobody moved. The waiter who had brought the check practically melted into the shadows, terrified of the explosive tension radiating across the table. I kept my eyes locked on my brother, watching the vein in his neck pulse furiously against his stiff white collar. I waited for someone and anyone to tell a 38-year-old man to sit down and stop throwing a temper tantrum in a 5-star restaurant. Instead, my father finally found his voice. Elias cleared his throat, using that booming, resonant tone he had perfected behind the pulpit of his massive Atlanta megachurch. He adjusted his custom silk tie and looked directly at me, completely ignoring the fact that his golden son was standing over the table looking ready to flip it over. "Camille, apologize to your brother," my father ordered. His voice left absolutely no room for debate, ringing with the absolute authority he wielded over his congregation every Sunday morning. "You are embarrassing yourself, and you are embarrassing us. There is no need for this theatrical display. Flaunting fake wealth just to stroke your own ego is a sin of pride, and it is entirely unbecoming of a woman your age. You know Julian carries the weight of the sterling name on his shoulders." I stared at the man who was supposed to be my spiritual and moral compass. Fake wealth. I had just dropped a Centurion card on the table, a card you cannot even apply for unless you spend millions a year, and his immediate reflex was to protect Julian's fragile ego by calling me a liar. My success was so unfathomable to him that he had to categorize it as a sin rather than an achievement. My mother saw her opening and took it with practiced precision. Vivian set her crystal wineglass down with a sharp, echoing clink. She leaned forward, the diamonds on her tennis bracelet catching the warm ambient light of the chandeliers. "Your father is right," Vivian said, her tone dripping with that lethal, polite Southern church lady judgment that could skin you alive without raising its volume. "We all know how your little public relations world works, Camille. It is all smoke and mirrors. Leasing a luxury condo downtown, renting expensive sports cars by the hour, just to look successful on social media for your clients. We are not foolish. We know you are struggling to keep up appearances. Julian is managing a real company, a legacy, and you are trying to upstage him with parlor tricks. Now pick up that silly metal card, pay whatever portion of the bill you can actually afford, and apologize for this outburst." I looked at my mother, observing the absolute conviction in her perfectly made-up eyes. She genuinely believed her own fiction. It was easier for her to believe I was a fraud facing bankruptcy than to accept that I had built an empire completely outside her sphere of influence. She needed me to be the struggling, bitter outcast, so her narrative of the perfect, flawless golden son remained intact. I opened my mouth to tell her that I owned the public relations firm she mocked. I was ready to tell her that I owned the commercial building it was housed in, and that the sports car she claimed I rented was fully paid off. I was prepared to drop my corporate financial statements right on top of her butter-poached lobster. But before I could say a single word, the heavy scraping sound of a wooden chair being pushed back echoed through the room, commanding immediate attention. Grandpa Jeremiah stood up slowly from the head of the table. He was 80 years old, a man carved out of pure grit and relentless ambition. He had built the sterling logistics empire from a single delivery truck during the civil rights era, fighting tooth and nail against a system designed to keep him down. He wore his age like a crown, his posture still impossibly straight, his dark gaze sharp enough to cut through solid steel. When Jeremiah Sterling moved, the room stopped breathing. My father instantly dropped his authoritative pastor persona. He sat up straighter, looking like a scolded schoolboy caught misbehaving in the front pew. Julian froze, his arms dropping awkwardly to his sides, the arrogant smirk completely wiped from his face. Chloe suddenly found her linen napkin absolutely fascinating, refusing to make eye contact with the patriarch of the family she had married into. Grandpa Jeremiah did not look at my parents. He did not look at Chloe. He locked his piercing eyes directly on Julian. The silence stretched thick and suffocating as he let his golden grandson squirm under his heavy scrutiny. "Julian, Grandpa." Jeremiah said, his voice quiet, but carrying a lethal, undeniable weight. "You just told your sister she does not deserve to carry the family name. You called her a stain." Julian puffed out his chest, desperately trying to muster the bravado he had just displayed seconds ago. "Grandpa, you know how she is?" Julian stammered, his voice betraying a slight nervous tremor. "She comes in here disrespecting the business, disrespecting me in front of my wife and my parents. I am just trying to protect what you built. I am the one running the daily operations. I am the one carrying the sterling legacy forward. She does not respect the name, so she does not deserve it." Grandpa Jeremiah let out a low, humorless chuckle that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. He reached into the inner pocket of his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a folded piece of thick, watermarked parchment paper. He placed it deliberately on the table right next to his half-empty plate. "Then she will carry mine," Grandpa Jeremiah said, his voice ringing with absolute finality. and everything that comes with it. The air in the VIP room seemed to instantly evaporate. My mother gasped a sharp, undignified sound of pure shock. My father gripped the edge of the mahogany table so hard, his knuckles turned a ghostly gray. Chloe let out a tiny squeak of pure panic, her hands flying to her throat as she realized her massive lifestyle budget was suddenly in severe jeopardy. Julian stared at the folded paper on the table, his eyes wide with a sudden terrifying realization. The arrogant facade shattered into a million unrecoverable pieces. His face went ashen, the sheer panic setting in as the catastrophic weight of our grandfather's words crushed him. No, Julian breathed out, his voice cracking like a frightened child. Grandpa, you cannot do this. You cannot do this to me. I am the eldest son. I am the sole heir. We already had the lawyers draft the transfer of the estate. The papers are with the legal team right now. You promised me the succession. You signed off on it. My father quickly jumped in, his pastoral voice returning thick with frantic desperation. Dad, please let us not be hasty. Julian is right. The family attorneys have already finalized the transition documents. The board of directors is expecting Julian to take over as chief executive officer by the end of the quarter. We have a unified front. You cannot just hand the keys to the kingdom over to Camille because of a dinner table argument. It will completely destroy the company's image in the business sector. Grandpa Jeremiah turned his gaze to my father, and the look of sheer, unadulterated disappointment on the old man's face made my father shrink back into his chair as if he had been physically struck. A unified front. Grandpa Jeremiah repeated, tasting the words like they were toxic. You talk about image, Elias. You talk about the lawyers drafting the transfer. But you continually fail to mention the fact that the lawyers who drafted those documents do not work for me. Julian took a trembling step back, bumping hard into the wall behind him. His breathing became shallow and erratic, his eyes darting frantically toward the exit. Grandpa Jeremiah picked up the folded parchment, tapped it against the mahogany table, and looked dead at Julian. You drafted a forgery, boy, he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, icy register that commanded the room. You and those cheap strip mall attorneys you hired tried to bypass my living trust. You thought I was too old and too blind to notice the discrepancies in the signature blocks. You thought you could steal the empire before I put you in the ground. My mother let out a loud, wailing cry, covering her mouth with both hands in absolute horror. My father stared at Julian in genuine shock, clearly completely unaware of the illegal lengths his golden son had gone to secure the family wealth. Chloe began shaking violently, her eyes darting between her husband and the man who held their entire financial future in his calloused hands. But Grandpa Jeremiah was not finished. He turned to look at me, and for the first time all evening the harsh, rigid lines on his face softened. He nodded at me, a silent, powerful cue passing between us. And Camille and I are going to prove it, Grandpa Jeremiah finished. The morning sunlight filtered through the floor-to-ceiling glass windows of my downtown Atlanta office, casting sharp shadows across the room. My public relations firm occupied the entire top floor of one of the most prestigious commercial towers in the city. It was a sprawling monument of polished concrete, white marble, and sleek modern art. I had built this crisis management empire entirely with my own hands, brick by metaphorical brick, while my family assumed I was doing basic freelance work out of a noisy coffee shop. I sat behind my massive clear glass desk, sipping a black espresso and reviewing the preliminary forensic audit reports my grandfather had sent over the night before. The financial numbers on Julian were far worse than I had ever imagined. The quiet calm of the morning suddenly shattered when the polished chrome doors of my private executive elevator slid open with a sharp, aggressive chime. Julian stormed past my receptionist, his face flushed with the same manic, uncontrolled energy he had displayed at the steakhouse the night before. Chloe was right beside him, her designer heels clicking frantically against the marble floor. But they did not come alone. Trailing behind my brother like obedient, nervous lapdogs were three men in cheap, ill-fitting suits carrying battered briefcases. They looked exactly like the kind of strip mall attorneys who advertised on highway billboards, the kind of desperate legal muscle you hire in the middle of the night when no respectable corporate firm will take your completely fabricated case. Julian marched directly into the center of my office, not even bothering to knock, and slammed a thick stack of legal documents onto the center of my pristine desk. He leaned forward, planting both hands on the glass, a triumphant, unhinged smile plastered across his face. "You really thought you and that crazy old man were going to take what rightfully belongs to me?" Julian snarled, tapping his index finger violently against the stack of papers. "You thought you could just humiliate me in front of my own family and steal my succession. Well, I spent all night on the phone with my legal team. This is an emergency medical injunction. As of 9 o'clock this morning, we have officially filed a petition with the court to declare Jeremiah Sterling medically incompetent. We are stating on the legal record that he is unfit to manage his own estate, unfit to make business decisions, and absolutely unfit to change the terms of his living trust." Chloe stepped up beside him, crossing her arms and looking around my immaculate office with a sneer of manufactured pity. She let out a breathy, condescending sigh, weaponizing her fake Southern charm. "We really hate to do this to poor Grandpa Jeremiah Camille," she said, her voice dripping with a sickly sweet poison. "We know his mind is failing him rapidly. It is truly tragic how severe dementia can make an old man turn against his own blood and legacy. But Julian has a heavy responsibility to protect the family assets from opportunistic vultures who want to manipulate a sick, confused elder." She looked at me, her blue eyes turning cold and calculating. "The court is going to freeze everything today. You are getting nothing, sweetie. Not a single dime of the Sterling money." One of the cheap lawyers cleared his throat, trying to puff out his narrow chest and look intimidating in a room that clearly intimidated him. He pointed a stubby, shaking finger in my direction. "Miss Sterling, any attempt to execute the forged documents your grandfather presented at dinner last night will result in immediate criminal charges for elder abuse and corporate fraud. We demand that you hand over any files, passwords, or communications pertaining to the Sterling Logistics empire right now. Failure to comply will result in a warrant for your arrest." I did not move a single muscle. I did not blink. I simply leaned back in my ergonomic leather chair and steepled my fingers, letting them bask in their complete and utter delusion. Before I could even issue a response to the pathetic legal threat, the heavy glass doors to my office swung open again. My parents, Vivian and Elias, strode into the room, acting like they owned the very air we were breathing. My father wore his dark Sunday preaching suit, and he immediately projected the booming, commanding voice he used to silence a congregation of 5,000 people. "Camille, this foolish, embarrassing rebellion ends right now." My father thundered, his voice reverberating off the high ceilings. "I will not have my daughter dragging this respected family into a public courtroom. I will not have my loyal congregation reading about lawsuits and medical injunctions in the morning paper. You will withdraw whatever ridiculous claims you and your grandfather fabricated last night. You will sign a legal statement acknowledging that Jeremiah is suffering from severe cognitive decline, and you will step aside immediately so your brother can assume his rightful position as head of this family." My mother stepped forward, her eyes narrowing with a familiar toxic resentment. She looked at me not as her child, but as an annoying, persistent obstacle she was finally ready to crush. "You have always been spiteful, Camille," she hissed, her voice lacing every word with pure venom. "You have always been bitter and jealous, because Julian was born to lead, and you were born to follow. That is the natural order of things. We tried to give you a good life. We tried to let you play at being an independent business owner, so you would not feel so incredibly inadequate next to your brother's massive success. But you have crossed a dangerous line, and you are entirely out of your depth." She took another step closer, pointing a perfectly manicured nail at my face. "If you do not drop this absurd vendetta right this second, Elias and I will cut you off completely. We will ruin your professional reputation in this city by tonight. And we will start by legally evicting you from that luxury Buckhead condo we so graciously let you rent. We pay for your lifestyle, Camille. You will be out on the street with your little bags packed by the end of the week, and we will personally make sure no respectable landlord in Atlanta ever signs a lease with you again. You are nothing without the Sterling protection." The room fell completely silent as they all stared at me, waiting for the heavy threat to sink in. They stood there in a unified toxic front, perfectly confident that they had backed me into an inescapable corner. They expected the old Camille, the young girl who used to swallow her pride and apologize just to keep the peace in the household. They expected me to lower my head, admit defeat, and surrender to Julian's golden authority. But that version of Camille had died a long time ago, buried under years of their relentless disrespect. I looked at my mother, then at my father, and finally let my eyes rest on Julian's smug, anticipating face. I slowly reached my hand forward and tapped a small silver button on the control panel embedded smoothly into the surface of my desk. Instantly, the massive smart glass wall behind me darkened, transforming from a transparent window overlooking the city into a massive high-definition projection screen. I tapped another button, and a certified notarized legal document materialized brightly on the glass, illuminated clearly for the entire room to read. It was a commercial property deed bearing official state seals and complex corporate registry numbers. I kept my voice perfectly level, stripping away every ounce of emotion until only pure, ice-cold authority remained. "You cannot evict me, Mom," I said smoothly, watching her eyes scan the glowing document behind me. "Because I do not rent that Buckhead condo. I bought the entire residential high-rise building 2 years ago through a blind shell corporate entity. In fact, if you look closely at the corporate holding structures listed on that screen, you will find out something even more interesting. You are currently standing in a commercial building that I also own." Julian threw his head back and let out a loud, braying laugh that echoed awkwardly against the high-polished ceilings of my executive office. He clapped his hands together slowly, stepping away from the glass desk with a look of supreme amusement. "Oh, that is brilliant, Camille. That is really top-tier graphic design work. You always did know how to put on a good visual presentation for your little clients. But do you honestly think a fake digital deed projected onto a fancy piece of smart glass is going to stop a Supreme Court medical injunction? You are living in an absolute fantasy world." He turned sharply and snapped his fingers at the lead attorney, a sweaty, nervous man whose gray suit jacket looked a full size too small for his shoulders. "Serve her the papers, Vance. Tell my little sister she has exactly 24 hours to pack up her fake public relations empire and vacate the premises before I have the sheriff down here throwing her designer bags onto the sidewalk." But Vance did not move. He was staring intensely at the smart glass wall behind me, his small eyes tracking the official state seals, the notarized digital signatures, and the specific corporate registry number of the shell holding company, listed clearly on the deed. In the Atlanta corporate scene, there were certain holding companies that commanded immediate unspoken respect. Vance pulled a cheap smartphone from his pocket, his thumbs flying across the cracked screen as he hastily accessed the public commercial property records database. The other two attorneys crowded around his shoulders, reading the screen over his arms. Their faces grew increasingly pale with every passing second. The aggressive bullying energy that had fueled their grand entrance was rapidly deflating, replaced by the sheer terror of realizing they had just walked into a legal minefield. Vance swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously in his throat. He leaned toward Julian and whispered something frantic in his ear, his eyes darting back toward me with newfound terror. Julian shoved the lawyer by the shoulder violently, nearly knocking the man off balance. "What do you mean it is real?" Julian hissed, completely abandoning his polished executive persona. "Look at her. She is a glorified party planner. There is absolutely no way she owns a $50 million commercial tower in the middle of downtown Atlanta. Check the registry again." I rested my hands on the smooth, cool edge of my desk. "I am a crisis management strategist, Julian. My entire business is built on knowing exactly who holds the leverage in any given room and knowing exactly how to dismantle those who foolishly overstep their bounds. You brought 3 strip mall lawyers to a corporate war zone without doing a single background check on my financial assets. That glaring lack of attention to detail is exactly why Grandpa Jeremiah decided to dissolve your succession plan." My mother stepped forward, her face twisted in a mask of pure aristocratic outrage. Her breathing was heavy, the expensive pearls around her neck rising and falling rapidly against her chest. "How dare you speak to your brother like that?" Vivian demanded, her voice vibrating with maternal fury. "We gave you everything, Camille. We put a roof over your head. We introduced you to the right people in Atlanta society. You are nothing but an ungrateful, spiteful child who cannot stand the fact that Julian was chosen to carry the torch. You think because you tricked some bank into giving you a commercial mortgage that you are suddenly a titan of industry. You are renting sports cars and playing businesswoman while your brother is trying to protect a real, tangible legacy. Drop this foolishness right now, or we will legally evict you from the residential condo we let you rent and ruin your reputation in this city by nightfall. My father positioned himself right beside her, squaring his broad shoulders to present a united front. He summoned the deep resonant baritone that commanded thousands of people every Sunday morning, the voice of divine authority that no one in our family was ever allowed to question. Camille Sterling, you will cease this embarrassing rebellion immediately. Elias thundered, pointing a heavy accusing finger directly at my face. Honor thy father and mother. You will respect the natural order of this family. You will sign the medical injunction acknowledging your grandfather's severe cognitive decline, and you will step aside so Julian can clean up this mess and assume his rightful position as head of the family. If you do not comply, you will face the absolute wrath of this family, and you will be completely isolated from our community. I looked at the man who was supposed to be my protector, the man who cared more about maintaining the illusion of a perfect golden son than acknowledging the reality of a highly competent daughter. I slowly walked around to the front of my glass desk, my heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. I crossed my arms and looked directly into my father's eyes, refusing to flinch or look away under his pastoral glare. The natural order of this family is a lie. Dad, I said, keeping my tone deadly calm and completely devoid of emotion. It is a fragile house of cards built entirely on Julian's incompetence and your blind enabling. You barged into my office waving a fabricated medical injunction claiming Grandpa Jeremiah has lost his mind. You are trying to convince the courts that he is a senile old man who was easily manipulated into changing his will by a bitter, jealous granddaughter. I turned my attention back to Julian, whose chest was heaving with panicked, shallow breaths. You actually think Grandpa changed the will because his mind is failing him? Julian, Grandpa. Jeremiah changed the estate transfer because his mind is sharper than yours will ever be. He did not come to me for emotional comfort or manipulation. He came to my firm because he needed a covert, independent forensic audit of the Sterling logistics empire. He knew the quarterly reports you were handing him did not make sense. He knew the profit margins were completely fabricated to hide your colossal failures. Julian's eyes widened in sheer, unadulterated terror. He looked at the three cheap lawyers who were already slowly inching their way toward the heavy glass doors, desperate to distance themselves from what was rapidly becoming a massive federal corporate fraud scandal. They realized they had been hired to file a fraudulent injunction against a highly powerful woman to cover up a mountain of financial crimes. "Shut up!" Julian yelled, taking a threatening, desperate step toward me. "Do not listen to her. She is lying. She is making all of this up to steal my company and ruin my life." I turned around, walked back to my desk, and opened a biometric drawer built seamlessly into the structure. I reached inside and pulled out a thick, heavy red folder. The color of the folder seemed to suck all the remaining oxygen right out of the room. It was the exact shade of red used by our grandfather's private accounting firm when they flagged critical financial discrepancies and missing assets. I held it up so they could all clearly see the gold foil crest stamped on the front cover. Julian stopped dead in his tracks, all the blood draining from his face. "This is not a medical dispute over an old man's declining health. Julian," I said, my voice cutting through the tense air like a blade. "This is a criminal investigation. Grandpa did not cut you out because of a simple business disagreement or a family squabble. He cut you out because the forensic audit team tracked the missing logistics capital directly to a series of offshore bank accounts. You did not just bankrupt 3 regional branches of our family company due to poor management. You owe $4 million to a high-stakes gambling syndicate in Las Vegas. You have been covering your massive margin calls for the last 18 months by quietly bleeding the family business dry." My mother let out a strangled, horrified gasp, clutching my father's arm to keep her balance. "Elias, tell me she is lying." Vivian pleaded, her voice trembling as the flawless reality she had constructed for her son completely shattered. "Tell me Julian did not do this to us." I looked at my father. His face was devoid of all color, his pastoral authority completely evaporated. He looked like a man standing on the gallows waiting for the floor to drop. I walked forward and firmly slid the heavy red folder across the smooth glass table directly toward him. The thick stack of paper inside represented the absolute, undeniable destruction of the Sterling family's immaculate public image. But Julian did not just use the logistics money, did he? Dad? I asked, my voice dropping to a harsh, unforgiving whisper that echoed in the silent room. When Julian ran out of corporate funds to steal, he came crying to you. Grandpa came to me because the auditors discovered Julian used the family's legacy church fund to pay off those massive Vegas gambling debts. And Dad, you co-signed every single one of the unauthorized withdrawals. My father stared down at the red folder as if it were a venomous snake preparing to strike. He could not speak. He could not defend himself. The great Pastor Elias was entirely silenced by the undeniable proof of his own sins. I turned my back on them, walked calmly to my leather chair, and pressed the silver button on my intercom system. Security. I said, my voice projecting clearly and calmly into the receiver. Please escort my tenants out of my building. The sanctuary of Genesis Cathedral in Alpharetta was less of a house of worship and more of a corporate arena, bathed in stained glass light. With a seating capacity of over 5,000, it was the crown jewel of my father's carefully curated public image. This was his territory, his kingdom, and by Sunday morning he had decided to turn it into a public execution chamber. My father stood behind his transparent acrylic pulpit, gripping the edges so tightly his knuckles strained against his dark skin. The massive high-definition screen suspended above the choir magnified his every expression. He was sweating through his bespoke suit, his chest heaving, as he delivered a fiery, impassioned sermon about betrayal within the sacred walls of the home. His voice echoed through the state-of-the-art sound system, completely devoid of the grace he preached about on any other given Sunday. He paced across the stage, pointing his finger toward the back of the room where he knew I was sitting. He did not use my name, but in a congregation composed of Atlanta's most elite black politicians, business owners, and socialites, he did not need to. Everyone knew exactly who he was talking about. He thundered into the microphone, his voice shaking with a manufactured righteous fury. He warned the congregation about the deep spiritual rot of wayward daughters destroying the family unit. He preached about the sin of arrogant children who mistake their brief moments of worldly success for true wisdom, daughters who become so blinded by their own selfish ambition that they attempt to tear down the very legacy their fathers and brothers bled to build. How was weaponizing the pulpit, using the word of God as a blunt instrument to discredit me before I could expose the massive financial crimes he and Julian had committed. It was a brilliant, desperate strategy. If he could convince the entire congregation that I was a bitter, spiteful woman having a mental breakdown, then any audit or evidence I presented would simply look like the frantic lies of a jealous sister. Down in the reserved front pew, my mother was playing her supporting role to absolute perfection. Vivian sat rigidly in her custom-tailored Sunday dress, pressing a lace handkerchief to her perfectly dry eyes. She nodded along to my father's booming words, letting out soft, performative sighs of maternal grief. Whenever the camera panned to her, she lowered her head, the very picture of a heartbroken mother praying for her lost rebellious child. For my entire life, this church had been their ultimate shield. Whenever Julian failed a class, crashed a car, or got caught stealing from the collection plate as a teenager, my parents simply marched into the sanctuary and preached about forgiveness, shifting the blame onto negative outside influences. Now they were using that exact same shield to protect Julian from a federal embezzlement scandal, and they were perfectly willing to completely destroy my reputation to do it. I sat in the very last row of the sanctuary, my posture perfectly straight, my hands resting calmly on a sleek black briefcase sitting on my lap. I did not flinch as my father's accusations washed over the crowd. I did not lower my head when the women in the pews ahead of me turned around to cast judgmental, pitying glances in my direction. I simply let the hypocritical spectacle run its course. When the service finally concluded, the massive congregation flooded out into the sprawling marble lobby. The lobby of Genesis Cathedral was notorious for being the ultimate high society networking floor. Deals were struck near the coffee stations, political alliances were forged by the coat check, and reputations were made or broken near the grand indoor fountains. I stepped out of the sanctuary and immediately spotted the second phase of their smear campaign already in full swing. Chloe was holding court near the center of the lobby, surrounded by a tight circle of the church's most influential and wealthy matrons. She was wearing a modest conservative dress she had clearly bought just for this performance, her blonde hair pulled back neatly, her face a mask of tragic, exhausted concern. As I walked closer, she raised her voice just enough to ensure the sound carried over the ambient noise of the crowd, making absolutely certain I would hear every single word. "It is just so hard on Julian," Chloe sighed, placing a hand over her chest as the older women leaned in with eager, gossip-hungry ears. "He loves his sister so much, but her mental state has just deteriorated so rapidly. She has been completely isolated, sitting alone in her apartment, fabricating these wild, paranoid delusions about the family business. Julian has tried to reach out and get her psychiatric help, but she just screams at him. We are just praying she finds a good husband soon, someone to ground her, so she stops obsessing over Julian's incredible success." One of the wealthy board members' wives gasped softly, shaking her head in deep sympathy. "Oh, you poor dear," the woman crooned, patting Chloe's shoulder. "It is always the unmarried ones who stir up the most trouble. They get so bitter watching their brothers build beautiful families. You and Julian just need to stay strong." My mother materialized right beside Chloe, seamlessly joining the theatrical performance. Vivian placed a comforting arm around her daughter-in-law, looking at the surrounding matrons with a heavy, dramatic sigh. "We are relying on our church family to help us through this dark season," my mother said, her voice dripping with sorrow. "We love Camille, but we simply cannot allow her toxic jealousy to disrupt the holy work Elias and Julian are doing for this community. We ask that you just ignore any of her desperate cries for attention." They had laid their trap perfectly. They had assassinated my character, framed my independence as a symptom of mental illness, and preemptively discredited any financial evidence I might try to present. They fully expected me to crack under the immense social pressure. They expected me to hear those humiliating whispers, feel the burning judgment of my own community, and run out the heavy glass doors of the church in tears, thoroughly defeated by their unified wall of lies. I did not run. I did not cry. I did not even break my stride. I adjusted my grip on the sleek black briefcase in my hand. Inside that briefcase was the heavy, undeniable truth. It held the fully executed independent forensic audit that Grandpa Jeremiah had ordered. It contained the exact bank routing numbers, the forged signatures, and the devastating proof that Julian had transferred over $1 million from the cathedral's youth outreach program directly to a high-stakes gambling syndicate to cover his margin calls. I walked with absolute chilling purpose across the polished marble floor. I did not look at Chloe, who suddenly stopped mid-sentence as she noticed me advancing. I did not look at my mother, whose fake, sorrowful smile instantly vanished into a tight line of sheer panic. I walked directly past their little circle of gossip, ignoring the sudden stunned silence that rippled through the lobby as people parted to let me through. My eyes were locked entirely on the far end of the grand lobby, right next to the massive cascading baptismal font. Standing there in a tight, exclusive circle were the 5 men who actually controlled the lifeblood of Genesis Cathedral. They were the senior members of the church financial board. These were the ruthless, pragmatic businessmen who managed the church's multi-million-dollar investment portfolios, the men who demanded absolute fiscal transparency and who held the power to strip my father of his pulpit in a matter of hours. I approached them with the steady, measured confidence of an executioner stepping up to the block, the head deacon. A tall, imposing man who had known me since I was a child stopped talking and looked down at the black briefcase in my hand, his brow furrowing in confusion. I stopped right in front of him, planting my feet firmly on the marble floor, completely ready to tear my family's pristine, holy facade down to its very foundations. The polished marble floor of the lobby seemed to amplify the frantic clicking of my mother's heels as she sprinted across the atrium. Vivian was not a woman who ran. She glided, she strolled, she held court. But in this exact fraction of a second, the meticulously maintained matriarch of Genesis Cathedral was absolutely sprinting her pristine Sunday facade, cracking under the sheer unadulterated terror of what I was about to do. I had barely planted my feet in front of the church financial board when her manicured hands clamped down onto my forearm like a vice. Her fingernails dug sharply through the fabric of my tailored blazer, desperate to physically drag me away from the baptismal font. "Camille, stop this insanity right now!" Vivian hissed. Her voice was a strained, breathy whisper, carefully modulated to avoid echoing across the cavernous room, but vibrating with a hysterical panic. She leaned in close, her expensive floral perfume failing to mask the sour scent of her sheer desperation. "You are embarrassing this family in the house of God. You are humiliating your father in front of his board of directors. Whatever petty vindictive lie you have inside that briefcase, you will turn around and march out those doors right this instant. If you open that case, I swear to you I will personally see to it that you are dead to this family. You will be erased." I did not break my gaze away from the head deacon, a towering, fiercely intelligent venture capitalist named Marcus Thorne. Marcus had served on the financial board for 15 years. He was not a man who was easily swayed by pastoral charisma or religious guilt trips. He was a man of ledgers, profit margins, and ruthless accountability. He stared down at my mother's white-knuckled grip on my arm, his thick eyebrows knitting together in a sharp display of suspicion. I slowly turned my head to look at my mother. I felt no sorrow, no lingering childhood desire for her approval, and absolutely no fear of her empty threats. "You erased me a long time ago, Mom," I said, my voice eerily calm, slicing through her hysterical panic with absolute precision. "You erased me the day you decided Julian's fragile ego was more important than my reality." With one smooth, practiced motion, I twisted my arm and effortlessly broke her grip. Vivian stumbled backward, her custom heels slipping awkwardly on the slick marble. She let out a soft, mortified gasp as she collided lightly with one of the ornate stone pillars. The sudden physical rejection completely short-circuited her brain. She looked around wildly, her eyes darting toward the high society matrons who were now watching the unfolding drama with unblinking, ravenous fascination. Her weaponized social pressure had failed, and she had absolutely no backup plan. I turned my full, undivided attention back to the 5 powerful men standing in a tight semicircle around the cascading waters of the baptismal font. I did not whisper. I did not keep my voice constrained to a polite, deferential volume. I engaged the exact same vocal projection I used when commanding a boardroom full of hostile corporate executives. "Gentlemen," I announced, my voice ringing out clear and authoritative, slicing cleanly through the ambient chatter of the massive lobby. Hundreds of heads snapped in my direction. Conversations died instantly. The clinking of coffee cups and the rustling of Sunday programs ceased. Within 5 seconds, the sprawling atrium of Genesis Cathedral went completely, deafeningly silent. Since my family is so incredibly concerned with spiritual transparency this morning, I continued, letting my words echo off the stained glass windows. And since my father just dedicated his entire Sunday sermon to the absolute necessity of rooting out deception from within the home, I thought it was only right to honor his holy mandate. I thought the board of directors should see the independent forensic audit that Grandpa Jeremiah ordered before his legal authority is fraudulently stripped away. Marcus Thorne shifted his weight, his dark eyes locking onto the sleek black briefcase in my hand. His posture stiffened, the instincts of a seasoned financial predator instantly taking over. "What audit?" Camille Marcus asked, his deep voice carrying a dangerous, demanding weight. "Your father assured this board that the Sterling Logistics empire was restructuring due to standard market fluctuations. He assured us that Jeremiah was stepping down purely due to rapid cognitive decline. Are you standing here in this sanctuary telling us that the pastor of this church lied to the financial board?" From the corner of my eye, I saw my father pushing his way through the frozen crowd. Elias was sweating profusely, his expensive silk tie suddenly looking like a noose around his thick neck. Julian was right behind him, his face completely devoid of color, looking like a cornered animal, desperately searching for an exit that did not exist. Chloe had completely abandoned her tearful, pious performance, her mouth hanging open in sheer, unadulterated horror as she realized the financial guillotine was finally dropping. "Camille, do not do this!" My father bellowed, his voice cracking with a pathetic, frantic desperation that completely shattered his wholly untouchable aura. He raised his hands, practically begging me across the expanse of the marble floor. "You are confused. You are letting your secular business mind cloud your spiritual judgment. This is a private family transition. We can handle this privately in my office. We do not need to trouble the board with internal misunderstandings." I ignored my father completely. He was a dead man walking, and he knew it. I pressed my thumbs against the dual silver latches of the black briefcase. The sharp metallic clicks echoed like gunshots in the dead silent lobby. I popped the lid open and retrieved a thick, heavy stack of documents bound in a brilliant blood-red folder. I held it out smoothly, offering the undeniable catastrophic truth directly to the head deacon. "There is no misunderstanding, Marcus," I said, maintaining absolute, unwavering eye contact with the man who held the financial keys to my father's kingdom. Grandpa Jeremiah did not lose his mind. He lost his patience. He hired my crisis management firm to run a covert independent forensic audit because the quarterly profit margins Julian was reporting did not align with reality. Marcus reached out and took the heavy red folder. The other 4 board members immediately crowded around his shoulders, their eyes scanning the first page of the executive summary. The gold foil crest of the independent auditing firm stared back at them, validating every single word printed on the heavy parchment paper. Julian did not just mismanage the family logistics company. I continued, raising my voice so every single wealthy donor, every society matron, and every political figure in that lobby could hear exactly who they had been idolizing. Julian bankrupt 3 regional delivery branches to cover massive unsustainable margin calls. But the commercial losses are not why I am standing in your lobby today. I took a step closer to the board, my expression hardening into stone. I looked directly at Julian, watching his knees actually buckle slightly under the crushing weight of his exposed crimes. Julian did not just lose his own money, I announced, dropping the final devastating hammer. He ran out of corporate funds 18 months ago. When the high-stakes gambling syndicate in Las Vegas came to collect his debts, he needed an immediate, untraceable influx of cash. So he came to his father. He came to your beloved pastor. Marcus Thorne's head snapped up from the documents, his eyes wide with a sudden terrifying realization. He looked at my father, and the sheer disgust radiating from the head deacon's face made Elias physically recoil. He embezzled $1.5 million from this congregation's youth outreach program to cover his margin calls. I stated, my words ringing with absolute lethal finality. The routing numbers, the offshore wire transfers, and the forged authorization signatures are all completely documented in that file. Every single withdrawal was co-signed by Elias Sterling to protect his golden son from a federal wire fraud indictment. A collective horrified gasp ripped through the massive lobby. The silence was instantly shattered by an eruption of furious, chaotic whispers. Board members began pulling out their phones. Wealthy donors stared at my father with utter revulsion. Vivian swayed on her feet, finally realizing that no amount of social maneuvering could possibly save them from a federal prison sentence. I smoothly clicked my empty briefcase shut and offered a polite, razor-sharp smile to the 5 men standing completely paralyzed by the baptismal font. Enjoy the reading. The absolute silence in the lobby of Genesis Cathedral lasted for exactly 3 agonizing seconds. It was the heavy, suffocating kind of quiet that precedes a catastrophic natural disaster. Marcus Thorne's dark eyes darted across the first page of the executive summary, absorbing the highlighted offshore account numbers, the forged digital signatures, and the exact dates corresponding to the massive withdrawals from the youth outreach program. The veins in Marcus's thick neck began to bulge against his starched white collar. He flipped to the second page, then the third, his breathing turning into a low, dangerous hiss. He handed the document to the board member standing next to him, a retired Superior Court judge who adjusted his glasses and immediately let out a sharp, horrified gasp. That single gasp was the spark that ignited the powder keg. The whispers began instantly, a rapid, hissing wave of shock that rippled outward from the baptismal font and infected the hundreds of people crowding the sprawling marble atrium. The high society matrons who had just been comforting my mother suddenly stepped back, their faces twisting in revulsion as the gravity of the accusation sank in. This was not a private family squabble over a business inheritance. This was the absolute desecration of the congregation's most sacred trust. The Youth Outreach Fund was the crown jewel of Genesis Cathedral's charity work, funded by the hard-earned tithes of the community, designed to keep vulnerable teenagers off the streets of Atlanta. And their golden boy had drained it to cover his blackjack losses and luxury car leases. Marcus Thorne took a deliberate heavy step forward, closing the distance between himself and my father. He did not look at Elias as his pastor. He looked at him as a criminal liability. Elias Marcus rumbled his voice, carrying a lethal, booming authority that completely dwarfed my father's usual Sunday resonance. You have exactly 10 seconds to tell me that this independent audit is a complete fabrication. You have 10 seconds to explain why the routing numbers on these wire transfers perfectly match the exact dates this board authorized you to move $1.5 million into the new Youth Center development account. My father physically recoiled, the color completely draining from his usually vibrant, commanding face. He opened his mouth desperately, trying to summon the booming, hypnotic cadence he used to control the masses from his acrylic pulpit. Brethren, he stammered, raising his hands in a frantic, placating gesture. The sweat was now pouring down his forehead, soaking the expensive collar of his custom suit. Let us not allow the enemy to sow seeds of division in the house of the Lord. There is a spiritual explanation for the reallocation of these funds. We must pray on this matter before we let secular accusations tear our community apart. Do not dare quote scripture to me while you are standing on stolen money, Marcus roared, slamming the heavy red folder against the edge of the stone baptismal font. The sharp crack echoed like a gunshot, making several people in the surrounding crowd physically jump. There is no spiritual explanation for wire fraud, Elias. You looked this board in the eye and swore those funds were secured. You co-signed these withdrawals. You authorized the transfer of our community's future to a high-stakes gambling syndicate to protect this worthless, entitled boy. The illusion of Elias Sterling's wholly untouchable authority shattered into a million irreparable pieces. The remaining board members moved in, effectively boxing him against the marble pillar. They demanded the master keys to the executive financial offices. They demanded his immediate surrender of the corporate church credit cards. My father shrank under their glaring scrutiny, his broad shoulders curling inward, his face twisting into a mask of pathetic, undeniable guilt. He was no longer the spiritual titan of Atlanta. He was just a terrified, corrupt old man caught red-handed. A few yards away, the reality of the situation was crashing down on Chloe with the force of a runaway freight train. Her entire identity within this church, her entire social standing in the city, was built entirely on her status as Julian's flawless, wealthy wife. She had spent the last 3 years parading around this predominantly African-American congregation, wielding her blonde hair and her Southern belle entitlement like a shield, expecting everyone to cater to her simply because she married the golden heir. But that shield was completely useless now. The congregation, betrayed and furious, turned their piercing, unblinking glares directly onto her. They looked at her designer dress, her diamond tennis bracelet, and her imported leather handbag, suddenly realizing exactly who had paid for those luxuries. Chloe's eyes widened in sheer panic as the high society matrons actively turned their backs on her, whispering loudly about the audacity of stealing from children to fund a luxury lifestyle. The carefully constructed mask of the pious, concerned sister-in-law melted off her face, replaced by the frantic, self-preserving instinct of a cornered rat. She spun around and grabbed Julian by the arm, her perfectly manicured fingernails digging violently into the sleeve of his suit. "Julian," she shrieked, her voice cracking with a shrill, hysterical panic that echoed over the angry murmurs of the crowd. "What is she talking about? You told me that money was a bonus. You told me the company paid out a massive executive dividend. You said we could afford the new house in Buckhead." "Keep your voice down, Chloe!" Julian hissed, his eyes darting frantically around the hostile lobby. He tried to pull his arm away, his face slick with a cold, terrified sweat. He looked like a cornered coward desperately trying to silence the wife he had lied to for years. "Just shut up and let me handle this." But Chloe was not going to sink with his ship. I am not shutting up, she yelled, shoving him backward with both hands. You stole from a church. You used a youth charity fund to pay off your disgusting Vegas debts and lied to my face about it. You are going to prison, Julian, and I am not going down with you. My mother witnessed the entire kingdom collapsing in the span of 60 seconds. She saw her husband cornered and stripped of his power by the furious board members. She saw her golden son publicly humiliated and abandoned by his own wife. Vivian realized with horrifying clarity that her weaponized social pressure had failed. Her threats were meaningless, and the pristine public image she had sacrificed her daughter to protect was completely annihilated. Desperate to regain control, desperate to distract the furious congregation and change the narrative, Vivian resorted to her ultimate final weapon. She pressed the back of her hand against her forehead, let out a loud theatrical gasp, and allowed her eyes to roll back in her head. She swayed dramatically on her expensive heels, waiting for the inevitable rush of concerned hands to catch her, waiting for the crowd to part, and the sympathetic cries to shift the attention back to the poor suffering matriarch. She swooned backward, but nobody moved. The society matrons simply watched her with cold folded arms. The deacons did not rush to her aid. The crowd deliberately stepped back, forming a wide, empty circle around her. Vivian hit the hard, polished marble floor with an ungraceful, heavy thud. Her designer hat skewed sideways. She lay there on the cold stone, opening one perfectly made-up eye to gauge the reaction, only to find the entire congregation staring down at her with absolute, unfiltered disgust. Her theatrical performance had failed. There was no pity left for the enablers of thieves. I did not stay to watch my father hand over his keys, nor did I wait for my mother to peel herself off the floor. My work inside Genesis Cathedral was completely finished. I turned my back on the chaos and pushed through the heavy glass doors of the lobby, stepping out into the bright, blinding Georgia sunlight. The cool morning air hit my face, crisp and clean, a stark contrast to the suffocating, toxic atmosphere I had just left behind. I walked down the wide concrete steps of the church, the sound of my heels striking the pavement with a steady, victorious rhythm. A profound, bone-deep sense of satisfaction washed over me. I had finally severed the chains of their manufactured guilt. I had stopped running, stopped accommodating, and stopped allowing them to dictate my worth. I reached the VIP parking area and approached my sleek charcoal gray Aston Martin. The car gleamed in the sunlight, a tangible manifestation of the empire I had built with my own hands. I unlocked the doors, tossed my purse onto the passenger seat, and slid behind the leather steering wheel. The quiet hum of the engine roaring to life felt like the ultimate declaration of independence. Just as I shifted the car into drive, my phone vibrated violently in the center console. The screen illuminated, displaying a text message from Julian. I did not need to open the message to feel the desperate, venomous rage radiating from his words. You are dead in this town. Watch your client list disappear by tomorrow morning, the morning after the massacre. The threat illuminated the screen of my phone, glowing harshly against the dark leather of my car interior. It was a pathetic, transparent attempt at intimidation, sent by a man who had just watched his entire kingdom crumble into dust. I did not reply to Julian. I simply shifted my car into drive and pulled out of the VIP parking lot, leaving the sprawling campus of Genesis Cathedral behind me. In my rearview mirror, I could still picture the absolute beautiful devastation I had orchestrated. The image of the church lobby descending into a frenzy of shattered illusions was permanently etched into my mind. I remembered the exact moment the tide turned. I remembered the board demanding answers from Elias, who could only stammer incoherently, his booming pastoral authority evaporating in mere seconds. I remembered my mother's theatrical, desperate faint onto the polished marble floor. Vivian had expected a rush of sympathetic hands to catch her, a chorus of concerned gasps, to instantly shift the narrative back to her suffering. Instead, the wealthy congregation simply stepped back, leaving her sprawled on the cold stone. Nobody rushed to her aid. Nobody offered her a handkerchief. They simply stared with unblinking, unfiltered disgust. And then there was Chloe. The memory of my sister-in-law's frantic realization was the sweetest parting gift. I remembered how Chloe had grabbed Julian's arm, her perfectly manicured fingernails digging violently into his expensive suit. Her inherent white privilege had completely failed to shield her from the glaring, betrayed eyes of the predominantly African American congregation. The people she had patronized for years were now looking at her designer dress and realizing exactly whose stolen tithes had paid for it. "You told me that money was a bonus," Chloe had snapped at Julian, her voice shrill and echoing over the chaotic murmurs of the crowd. Her face had twisted into a mask of pure terror, terrified not of her husband's moral decay, but of her own impending social ruin. That was yesterday. Today was Monday morning, and Julian was executing the exact threat he had sent to my phone. He knew he could not save himself from the federal wire fraud indictment that was surely coming, so he had decided to take me down with him. The Scorched Earth Campaign. When I stepped off the private elevator and into the sleek glass-walled reception area of my crisis management firm, the atmosphere was electric with panic. My entire staff was operating at a frantic, chaotic pace. Telephones were ringing incessantly, a discordant symphony of flashing red lines. My lead account executive, David, intercepted me before I even reached my office door. His tie was loosened, and he was gripping a printed dossier tightly in his hands. Julian launched a massive smear campaign at 5 in the morning. David said, his voice clipped and professional, though his eyes betrayed his deep concern. He leveraged every single remaining contact within the Sterling Logistics vendor network. He bypassed standard communication channels and went directly to the executive boards of our top 5 PR clients. I set my briefcase down on my glass desk, my expression remaining completely impassive. What is the narrative? He is claiming that our crisis management firm is a front for corporate espionage, David explained, handing me the printed dossier. He manufactured a highly sophisticated paper trail, suggesting that you have been illegally harvesting proprietary data from your clients to build your own portfolio. He is telling them that you are currently the target of an active sealed federal investigation, and that any company associated with you will be subpoenaed by the Securities and Exchange Commission before the end of the week. It was a brilliant, desperate, scorched earth tactic. Julian was projecting his own impending federal nightmare directly onto me. He knew exactly how the corporate world operated. In the realm of high-stakes public relations and crisis management, reputation and absolute discretion were the only currencies that mattered. A rumor of an SEC investigation was worse than a guilty verdict. Corporate boards did not wait for the truth to be verified. They severed ties immediately to protect their own shareholders. "Have we lost anyone yet?" I asked, skimming the fabricated documents. The forgeries were remarkably detailed, likely drafted by the very same expensive fixers Julian had used to drain the church accounts. 3 of our mid-level clients just sent termination notices via their legal departments, David answered grimly. They invoked the morality clauses in their contracts. But that is not the primary issue. Apex International just called. The CEO's office demands your presence immediately. They want a face-to-face meeting, and they want it in exactly 45 minutes. The air in my office seemed to drop 10 degrees. Apex International was a massive, sprawling tech conglomerate. They were our cornerstone client, representing nearly 40% of our firm's annual revenue. If Apex dropped me today, the cascading effect would trigger a mass exodus. My firm would be completely bankrupted by Friday. Julian knew exactly where to strike. He knew that I was funding Grandpa Jeremiah's expensive, aggressive legal defense out of my own pocket. Without the revenue from my firm, I would be unable to retain the high-powered attorneys necessary to protect Jeremiah from Elias and Julian's fraudulent conservatorship. "Tell my driver to bring the car around," I instructed David, my voice devoid of panic. "Prepare our own counter dossier. Compile every single piece of evidence from the church audit. Prepare the wire transfer logs, the offshore account details, and the forged authorization signatures. I am not going to defend myself against a ghost. I am going to show Apex exactly what a real federal indictment looks like." The subterranean ambush. The drive to the downtown Atlanta headquarters of Apex International was tense and completely silent. The towering steel and glass skyscraper loomed ahead, a fortress of corporate power that held the fate of my entire livelihood within its walls. My driver navigated down the steep spiraling ramp into the subterranean VIP parking garage. The concrete cavern was dimly lit, echoing with the low hum of luxury vehicle engines and high-grade ventilation systems. I stepped out of the back seat of my car, gripping the handle of my leather briefcase tightly. The heavy, undeniable proof of Julian's guilt was secured inside. I took a deep breath of the cool, recycled air, preparing to walk into the boardroom and fight for my professional life. As I approached the private executive elevator bank, the sharp, unmistakable clatter of designer heels echoed through the empty concrete structure. A shadow detached itself from the side of a massive concrete pillar. It was Chloe. She was waiting for me. She wore a severe black designer trench coat, her blonde hair pulled back into a tight, severe bun. The pious, sweet Southern belle facade had been completely incinerated. The woman stepping into my path was a venomous, cornered socialite who was watching her entire universe collapse. She had tracked me down, undoubtedly using her family's country club connections to monitor the Apex executive schedules, just to twist the knife before I faced the firing squad. "You actually think you can win this?" Chloe sneered, stepping directly into my path and blocking the polished steel doors of the elevator. Her face was contorted with a vicious, unadulterated hatred. "You think walking into a boardroom with your little documents is going to save you?" I stopped 3 feet away from her, my posture perfectly straight, my expression an impenetrable mask of ice. "Step aside, Chloe. You are trespassing on private corporate property." She laughed, a harsh, grating sound that bounced off the concrete walls of the garage. The gloves were completely off. She no longer needed to pretend to be the dutiful Christian wife. She stepped closer, her eyes blazing with raw elitist entitlement. "Julian is a legacy son," Chloe snarled, practically spitting the words at me. "You're a nobody. You have always been a nobody. Do you honestly think the corporate titans in this building are going to side with a bitter, estranged daughter over the sterling family name? When your clients drop you today, you won't have the cash to pay Grandpa's legal fees. You will lose your firm. You will lose your grandfather. And Julian and Elias will maintain control over everything. You played a stupid game, Camille, and now you are going to lose everything you built." I looked at her. I looked at the frantic desperation hiding just beneath her vicious bravado. She believed the lies she was telling. She genuinely believed that generational wealth, white privilege, and a manufactured legacy were enough to overpower the cold, hard truth contained in my briefcase. She expected me to break. She expected me to panic, to argue, to beg. Instead, I simply smiled. It was a slow, terrifying, deeply confident smile that reached all the way to my eyes. The sheer serenity of my expression caused Chloe to falter. Her sneer wavered, a sudden flicker of absolute terror flashing across her face. I did not utter a single word in response. I did not need to. I smoothly stepped past her, the fabric of my tailored blazer brushing lightly against her heavy trench coat. I pressed the call button for the executive elevator. The polished steel doors slid open immediately with a soft, welcoming chime. I stepped inside the brightly lit cab, turned around, and maintained unblinking eye contact with my terrified sister-in-law as the heavy steel doors smoothly slid shut, sealing me inside and carrying me upward to the corporate guillotine. The elevator ascended with a silent, terrifying speed, propelling me toward the pinnacle of Apex International. The digital floor indicator ticked upward in rapid succession, each glowing red number, a heartbeat, each floor, a step closer to the corporate execution my brother had meticulously orchestrated. I gripped the leather handle of my briefcase, the smooth, cool material grounding me in the present reality. Inside were the forensic audits, the offshore wire transfer logs, and the undeniable, heavily documented proof of Julian's crimes. Chloe's shrill, desperate threats in the parking garage had not shaken me. They had only confirmed what I already knew to be true. The Sterling family relied on intimidation because they lacked actual ammunition. They operated on the assumption that their legacy name would always act as an impenetrable shield. But legacy could not shield you from federal indictments. I stepped out of the elevator into the sprawling penthouse reception area of Apex International. The entire floor was a breathtaking expanse of frosted glass, polished chrome, and minimalist corporate luxury. It was a fortress of multi-billion-dollar decision-making, a place where fortunes were minted and destroyed before the morning coffee got cold. The receptionist, a sharply dressed woman, who usually greeted me with a warm, familiar smile, looked up with wide, anxious eyes. She did not say a word. She simply gestured silently toward the main executive boardroom at the far end of the corridor. I nodded, my heels sinking slightly into the plush charcoal carpet as I marched toward the towering glass walls of the conference room. As I approached the transparent walls of the boardroom, the scene inside snapped into sharp, infuriating focus. At the far end of the massive mahogany table sat Victor Vance, the ruthless, pragmatic CEO of Apex International. Victor was a man who valued absolute loyalty but worshipped profit above all else. Standing rigidly to his right was David, my lead account executive, looking pale, sweating lightly, and completely out of his depth. But it was the man sitting directly across from Victor who made my blood run cold. Julian. My brother had beaten me here. He was sitting in one of the plush, ergonomic executive chairs, his bespoke suit perfectly tailored his posture, exuding a relaxed, entitled arrogance. He had a glossy, leather-bound presentation folder open on the table in front of him. He was gesturing casually with his hands flashing that practiced, charismatic, sterling smile. He was completely in his element, leveraging his gender, his family name, and his generational privilege to systematically dismantle my entire life. I pushed the heavy glass door open. It swung silently on its heavy steel hinges, allowing me to step into the room just in time to hear the venomous climax of my brother's pitch. Julian leaned forward, resting his elbows on the polished mahogany, adopting a tone of deep manufactured masculine sympathy. He looked directly at Victor, speaking man to man, deliberately excluding David from the exchange, as if my executive was nothing more than a piece of furniture. "Look, Victor," Julian said, his voice dripping with a faux heavy concern. "I have immense respect for the work my sister has done for you in the past. We all do. But you and I both know that corporate stability requires leadership with a clear, rational mind. Camille is a hysterical woman who is currently dealing with a severe mental health crisis." Julian sighed, shaking his head with a perfect, calculated display of familial grief. "It is a tragic family situation, truly. She has become completely paranoid, fabricating wild delusions about our family's logistics empire to mask her own professional inadequacies. I hate to be the one to bring this to your door, but she is facing a massive federal investigation for corporate espionage, Victor. The SEC is already circling. You cannot afford to have Apex International tied to a sinking ship when those subpoenas start flying." Julian tapped the glossy, leather-bound folder in front of him, pushing it an inch closer to the CEO. "Sterling Logistics has just launched an elite, highly discreet corporate relations division. We have the infrastructure, the financial backing of a 50-year legacy, and the high-level government contacts to absorb your public relations contracts seamlessly. We can transition your entire account by the end of the business day, protecting you and your shareholders from the imminent fallout of Camille's indictment." Julian leaned back, crossing his arms, looking like a triumphant king who had just conquered a new territory. Then he noticed me standing inside the doorway. His smug, arrogant smile faltered for a fraction of a second, but he quickly recovered, his eyes narrowing into a dark, daring challenge. He fully expected me to scream. He expected me to march up to the table and throw a tantrum. He expected me to act exactly like the hysterical, unstable woman he had just described to the CEO of a tech conglomerate. He desperately wanted me to lose my temper to prove his fabricated narrative right here in the boardroom. I did not give him the satisfaction. I did not raise my voice. I walked slowly and deliberately across the expanse of the room. I did not look at Julian. I kept my eyes locked entirely on Victor Vance. I reached the center of the table and placed my black briefcase on the mahogany surface. The heavy, authoritative thud of the case echoed loudly, breaking the tense silence of the room. "Good morning, Victor," I said, my voice perfectly level, carrying the cool, detached authority of a seasoned executive. "I apologize for the slight delay. I was momentarily detained in your subterranean parking garage by a woman who seemed to be under the wild delusion that generational wealth is a valid substitute for federal compliance." Victor did not say a word. He sat perfectly still, his sharp blue eyes darting between me and Julian, his hands folded neatly on the table, waiting to see who would draw blood first. Julian scoffed, a short, dismissive sound designed to reassert his dominance over the room. Camille, this is exactly the kind of erratic, unhinged behavior I was just explaining to Victor, Julian said, shaking his head with a heavy theatrical sigh. You barge into a private executive meeting spouting paranoid nonsense. Please just go home. I will call Mom. We can get you the psychiatric help you so clearly need. Do not embarrass yourself further. I slowly turned my head to look at my brother. My expression was completely blank, stripped of any lingering sisterly affection, devoid of any familial loyalty. I looked at him not as blood but as a hostile corporate liability that needed to be neutralized. You are currently attempting to sell a multi-million-dollar corporate relations package to a tech conglomerate using a logistics company that has exactly zero capital. I stated my words, slicing through the sterile air of the boardroom with surgical precision. Sterling Logistics is completely insolvent, Julian. You secretly bankrupted 3 of your largest regional delivery branches in the last 18 months. You forged Grandpa Jeremiah's signature to cover massive, unsustainable margin calls. Julian's face instantly lost all of its color. The practiced, arrogant smirk vanished, replaced by a stark, naked terror. He opened his mouth to speak, but his throat suddenly seemed completely dry. His eyes darted toward Victor, desperate to maintain the illusion, but the damage was already done. I reached out and popped the dual silver latches on my briefcase. The sharp clicks echoed loudly. I pulled out the heavy blood-red folder containing the independent forensic audit and slid it smoothly across the table until it rested directly in front of the CEO. I am not under federal investigation. Victor. I continued, my voice steady and unwavering, locking eyes with the CEO. But my brother is. He embezzled $1.5 million from a church youth charity, and when a high-stakes gambling syndicate in Las Vegas came to collect his debts, he dragged our father into a federal wire fraud conspiracy to cover it up. By tomorrow morning, the FBI will be raiding the Sterling Logistics corporate offices. Julian came here today to try and steal your retainer because he is completely desperate for an immediate cash infusion to hire criminal defense attorneys. He is trying to use your company as a human shield. The silence in the boardroom was absolute. David, my account executive, was staring at the red folder as if it were a live grenade. Julian was gripping the padded arms of his leather executive chair so tightly his knuckles were turning stark white. He was breathing heavily, his chest heaving as the walls of his fraudulent, perfectly manicured empire closed in around him. He looked at Victor, his eyes wide and pleading desperately, hoping the older man would honor the unspoken code of the wealthy old boys club. Victor Vance did not say a word for a long, agonizing moment. He slowly reached out and placed his large hand flat on top of Julian's glossy, leather-bound presentation folder. He did not open it. He did not flip through the carefully designed pages. He simply looked at Julian with an expression of cold, deadpan boredom. With one smooth, deliberate motion, Victor slid Julian's proposal back across the polished mahogany table. It stopped right in front of Julian's trembling hands. Victor then shifted his gaze entirely away from my brother, dismissing him from existence with a single look. He looked directly at me. Are we ready to proceed with the acquisition, Ms. Sterling? Victor asked, his voice calm and entirely serious. Julian's head snapped back, his face contorted in utter, absolute confusion. He looked back and forth between Victor and me, completely unable to process the words he had just heard. He had come here to steal a public relations client, completely unaware of the massive, game-changing empire I had been quietly building in the shadows. I walked past my brother's frozen, trembling form. I pulled out the heavy leather chair at the absolute head of the boardroom table and sat down, folding my hands neatly in front of me. We are. Julian stared at me, his jaw completely slack. His perfectly styled hair suddenly looked unkempt as he ran a trembling hand through it, ruining the expensive pomade. He looked from me to Victor, his eyes darting back and forth like a trapped bird, realizing the cage door had just locked. Victor, you cannot be serious, Julian stammered. His voice climbed an entire octave, shredding the deep masculine baritone he had been projecting just moments before. You are going to let this woman dictate your corporate acquisitions. She is facing a federal indictment. I just told you the SEC is breathing down her neck. You cannot risk Apex International on a massive liability. Victor Vance steepled his fingers. his expression shifting into one of mild clinical fascination. He looked at Julian not as a fellow executive but as an insect under a microscope. Julian Victor, said, his tone entirely devoid of warmth. The only federal agents operating in this city today are currently dismantling your father's executive suite at Genesis Cathedral. I know this because my own legal team coordinated with the FBI field office early this morning to ensure our acquisition targets were insulated from the fallout. Julian's chest stopped moving. He physically stopped breathing. Victor gestured precisely toward me. Camille is not merely a public relations consultant. She is a highly strategic asset. For the past 12 months, her firm has been quietly facilitating blind acquisitions for the Apex International Venture Capital Division. Your attempt to assassinate her character, using my boardroom as a stage, was not only poorly researched, it was a severe insult to my intelligence. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the cool mahogany. The adrenaline in my veins was running ice cold, completely numbing me to any residual sibling sympathy. I looked Julian dead in the eye, watching the last remnants of his golden boy entitlement evaporate into the sterile air conditioning of the corporate high-rise. You have always suffered from a fatal lack of imagination, Julian, I said. My voice was steady, carrying the acoustic weight of the entire room. You assumed I was just a spin doctor. You thought my crisis management firm only dealt with press releases and non-disclosure agreements. You never bothered to look at the corporate filings. If you had, you would have realized that true crisis management often involves acquiring the distressed assets of the people causing the crisis. Julian swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing erratically against his silk collar. What are you talking about? I am talking about your shadow ledgers, I stated, watching his eyes widen in pure, unadulterated horror. When you drained the Church Youth Outreach Fund, it only covered your immediate margin calls with the Vegas syndicate. But you still had a massive gaping hole in the Sterling Logistics operating budget. You needed operational capital to keep the trucks running and hide the initial embezzlement from Grandpa Jeremiah. So you took out a high-interest predatory commercial loan. Julian gripped the edge of the table. His knuckles were bone white. You cannot possibly know about that. I know absolutely everything, Julian. You went to Vanguard Supply Chain Solutions, I said, reciting the details with flawless, punishing accuracy. You used the final unencumbered assets of Sterling Logistics as collateral to secure a $4 million mezzanine loan. You told Dad it was a strategic partnership for fleet expansion, and you had him blindly co-sign the guarantor agreements. You thought you were so incredibly clever, hiding your toxic debt in a vendor shell company. I gestured gracefully toward the CEO sitting silently to my right. Julian, I would like to officially introduce you to my silent partner, I announced. Victor Vance and Apex International do not just hire me for optics. We build portfolios together. And not only did Victor not drop my firm this morning, but exactly 10 minutes ago, while you were sitting in the lobby, practicing your pathetic little sales pitch, Apex finalized the hostile takeover of Vanguard Supply Chain Solutions. The words hit Julian with the physical force of a wrecking ball. He leaped out of his leather executive chair, his body violently rejecting the information. The heavy piece of furniture rolled backward and crashed into the glass wall behind him. The loud, violent thud rattled the boardroom, but neither Victor nor I flinched. David, my account executive, stood perfectly still in the corner, watching his boss execute a flawless corporate assassination. Julian was completely, undeniably trapped. The arrogant, untouchable heir of the Sterling Empire was suddenly hyperventilating, his eyes wide and bloodshot. He paced a tight, frantic circle behind the table, his hands pulling at his own tie as if he were suffocating. The man he had just tried to court, the man he had just tried to impress with his manufactured legacy, was now the absolute owner of his catastrophic multi-million-dollar debt. No, Julian gasped, his voice breaking into a pathetic, wheezing croak. No, you cannot do that. Vanguard is a private holding firm. They do not just sell corporate debt to tech companies. This is illegal. You are violating corporate confidentiality. Vanguard was over-leveraged and desperate for a buyout. Victor chimed in, his voice cutting through Julian's panic like a scalpel. They sold your debt for pennies on the dollar to clear their own liabilities before the end of the fiscal quarter. We now hold the master promissory notes, Julian. All of them, including the personal guarantor clauses you and your father signed. Julian stopped pacing. He stared at me, his face a mask of absolute crushing despair. The scorched earth tactic he had launched at 5 in the morning had been completely obliterated. He had thought he could burn my professional reputation to the ground, never realizing that I already owned the ground he was standing on. "Camille, please," Julian whispered. The arrogance was completely stripped from his tone, leaving behind only the terrified, whining boy he had always been when caught in a lie. "Please. If you call in that loan, I lose the company. The board will seize Sterling Logistics by the end of the day. Grandpa will lose everything he built. Dad will go to prison. Grandpa Jeremiah already lost everything the day you decided his legacy was your personal piggy bank," I replied, my voice devoid of a single ounce of pity. "And Dad made his own choices when he decided to co-sign your fraud using the congregation's tithes. Do not try to weaponize family loyalty now, Julian. You set that bridge on fire the second you tried to destroy my client list this morning." I reached into my briefcase one final time. I pulled out a thick legal document bound in heavy blue cardstock. The gold seal of the Apex Legal Department was stamped clearly on the front page. I placed my hand flat on top of the document and smoothly slid it across the long mahogany table. It glided silently, stopping exactly an inch from where Julian stood, trembling. Julian stared down at the document as if it were a venomous snake preparing to strike. "That is an official, expedited notice of default," I said, my tone echoing with absolute, unyielding finality. "Your loans have been called in. Due to the fraudulent nature of your collateral and the active federal investigation surrounding your co-signer, the grace period has been legally waived." Julian looked up, his eyes welling with terrified, frantic tears. "I do not have $4 million, Camille. You know I do not. The church accounts are frozen. The company accounts are drained. I have absolutely nothing left." I leaned back in my chair, folding my arms across my chest, mirroring the exact posture he had used when he tried to dismiss me just 10 minutes earlier. "Then I highly suggest you start liquidating," I commanded. "You have exactly 48 hours to pay the $4 million in full. If the funds are not wired into the Apex holding account, by Wednesday morning we are executing the asset seizure clauses." Julian shook his head wildly, a pathetic whimper escaping his throat. "I have nothing to seize. The Buckhead house is mortgaged to the hilt. The cars are leased. You cannot get blood from a stone." "You are forgetting the fine print, Julian," I said, smiling a chilling, predatory smile. "Do you remember when you used to mock me during family dinners? You used to laugh because I spent my weekends reading corporate law textbooks while you were out playing golf at the country club. You told me I was wasting my time because the Sterling men were born to be executives and women were just meant to be administrators." I tapped my manicured fingernail against the polished wood of the table. "If you had bothered to read your own loan agreements, you would know that you commingled the Vanguard loan funds with your joint marital accounts," I explained, watching the final crushing wave of realization hit him. "You used that shadow money to pay the mortgage on the Buckhead estate. You used it to pay for Chloe's country club memberships. By co-mingling those assets, you legally pierced the corporate veil." Julian let out a sharp, choked gasp, stumbling backward against the glass wall. "Your loans have been called in," I repeated, my voice dropping to a deadly quiet register. "You have 48 hours to pay in full, or we are seizing your house, your cars, and legally freezing Chloe's trust fund." The 48-hour deadline expired in absolute silence. The holding account at Apex International remained entirely empty. Julian did not wire the $4 million. He did not surrender the keys to his mortgaged Buckhead estate, nor did he hand over the titles to his fleet of leased luxury vehicles. Instead of capitulating to the financial guillotine I had positioned directly over his neck, my family chose the only survival tactic they had ever truly understood: absolute unapologetic delusion. The FBI had raided the Sterling Logistics corporate offices exactly as I promised they would. Agents in windbreakers had carried out dozens of cardboard boxes filled with falsified ledgers and hard drives. The news of the raid was already beginning to seep into the local business journals, generating a toxic cloud of whispers that threatened to suffocate the family name. The board members at Genesis Cathedral had quietly stripped Elias of his pastoral authority, locking him out of the executive suites, while the independent auditors combed through the wreckage of the Youth Outreach Fund. Any rational human being facing a federal wire fraud indictment and a $4 million corporate debt, would have immediately contacted a defense attorney and filed for bankruptcy. But Vivian and Elias Sterling were not rational. They were cornered narcissists obsessed with their public image. They believed that if they simply projected enough wealth, the consequences of their crimes would magically disappear. Driven to a state of absolute desperation, my parents decided to throw a party. It was billed as a lavish celebration of their 40th wedding anniversary, hosted at the Oakwood Country Club, the most exclusive, heavily guarded enclave for Atlanta's black elite. It was a spectacular display of financial hemorrhage. Vivian had somehow managed to leverage the last of her personal credit lines to secure the grand ballroom, hiring a 50-piece orchestra, importing tens of thousands of dollars in rare floral arrangements, and commissioning a 5-tier cake covered in edible gold leaf. She had invited 300 of the city's most influential figures. Mayors, superior court judges, real estate moguls, and media executives were all summoned to witness the enduring glory of the Sterling family. The anniversary gala was a brilliant, shimmering facade designed to blind the city to the rotting foundation beneath them. Vivian wanted to force the high society matrons who had turned their backs on her at the church to publicly smile and drink her champagne. She wanted to prove that she was still the untouchable matriarch of Atlanta. But the party was not just Vivian's desperate attempt at social resuscitation. It was Julian's ultimate final weapon. My brother knew his logistics firm was dead. He knew Apex International held his debt and that I held the detonator. So he devised a strategy built entirely on emotional blackmail and public manipulation. Julian had spent the last 48 hours quietly seeding a false narrative among the invited guests. He had heavily implied to the city's top business reporters that the anniversary gala would double as a historic corporate announcement. I was telling everyone that tonight was a passing of the torch. Julian planned to use the glittering public stage to announce a massive family merger. He intended to stand in front of 300 elite members of society, raise a glass of champagne, and falsely declare that Grandpa Jeremiah was officially merging his legendary real estate empire with Sterling Logistics, placing Julian at the helm of the newly combined dynasty. It was a trap of spectacular audacity. Julian knew that Grandpa Jeremiah absolutely despised public scandals. The old man had spent 60 years keeping his name spotless, avoiding tabloid gossip and messy public disputes at all costs. Julian was banking his entire future on that single character trait. He believed that if he made the announcement in front of the most powerful people in Georgia, Jeremiah would be too embarrassed to contradict him. He assumed the patriarch would simply smile, nod, and play along to protect the family dignity, effectively forcing Jeremiah to absorb Julian's $4 million debt and rescue him from federal prison. It was a strategy that relied on everyone playing their assigned roles. The golden son making his triumphant ascent, the proud parents looking on, the silent, accommodating patriarch securing the legacy. There was only one flaw in Julian's meticulous plan. He had severely underestimated exactly how much information I possessed, and he had completely misjudged the wrath of the man he was trying to manipulate. I was not sitting at home watching my family orchestrate their fraudulent survival. I was sitting in the back of a pristine black Rolls-Royce Phantom, driving slowly through the manicured oak-lined avenues leading toward the country club. And I was not alone. Grandpa Jeremiah sat beside me on the plush leather seat. He was dressed in a flawless midnight blue tuxedo, his silver hair perfectly brushed, his posture radiating a terrifying absolute calm. His ancient weathered hands rested on the silver handle of his walking cane. I had spent the previous evening at his estate, laying out every single piece of evidence I had gathered. I showed him the forged conservatorship documents Elias had drafted to steal his real estate holdings. I showed him the offshore wire transfers Julian had used to drain the church accounts. I detailed the predatory loan Julian had taken out, and I explained exactly how I had acquired that debt to trap him. I had expected Jeremiah to express sorrow or disbelief. Instead, he had simply examined the documents with the cold, calculating eyes of a man who had built an empire from dirt. The betrayal of his son and grandson had not broken him. It had ignited a quiet, lethal fury. When I told him about the anniversary gala and Julian's plan to ambush him on stage, Jeremiah had simply instructed his tailor to prepare his evening wear. "Are you ready for this, Grandpa?" I asked softly, watching the glow of the country club approach in the distance. Jeremiah did not turn his head. He kept his eyes locked firmly on the road ahead. "I spent my entire life building a name that meant integrity. Camille." He rumbled, his voice low and vibrating with a heavy, unyielding power. "I will not allow your father and your brother to use that name to shield themselves from their own cowardice. Tonight we do not protect the illusion. Tonight we dismantle it." The Rolls-Royce glided smoothly past the heavily guarded wrought iron gates of the Oakwood Country Club. The sprawling neoclassical clubhouse was brilliantly illuminated against the night sky. The sweeping circular driveway was a parade of luxury vehicles, attended by a dozen valets, rushing to open doors for women in designer gowns and men in tailored suits. The faint, elegant strains of classical music drifted through the warm evening air, mingling with the sound of clinking crystal and polite high society laughter. As my driver pulled the car up to the grand columned entrance, the reality of the situation became starkly clear. My family was inside, completely unaware that the executioner had just arrived. My driver shifted the car into park and immediately stepped out to open my door. I slid out of the back seat, smoothing the fabric of my emerald green evening gown, feeling the crisp, cool air against my skin. I turned to offer my hand to Jeremiah, helping him step out onto the red carpet that had been rolled out over the cobblestone drive. Before we could even take a step toward the towering double doors of the clubhouse, a figure detached itself from the shadows of the grand portico. It was my father. Elias Sterling had clearly been standing outside, frantically monitoring the arriving cars. He was wearing a custom peak lapel tuxedo, but the pristine elegance of the garment was completely ruined by his physical state. He was sweating profusely, his face glistening under the ambient lighting. His breathing was shallow and rapid, his eyes darting around with the frantic, terrified energy of a cornered animal. He looked like a man who knew he was standing on a trapdoor. He rushed forward, stepping directly into our path, ignoring the curious glances of the valets and the arriving guests. He did not look at Jeremiah. He locked his desperate, bloodshot eyes entirely on me. "Camille!" Elias hissed, his voice trembling with a raw, pathetic panic. He raised both hands, a frantic gesture begging us to stop. "You cannot go in there." I stood my ground, my expression completely impassive, watching the former spiritual titan of Atlanta reduce himself to a begging coward. Elias took a step closer, his voice dropping to a frantic, breathless whisper. "Please. Half the city is in that ballroom. The mayor is sitting at our table. Don't do this, Camille. I know what Julian did, but we can fix it quietly. We can handle it internally. If you walk in there and cause a scene, the shame will kill your mother. Protect the family name." I looked at my father with ice in my veins. "You did not care about the family name when you let Julian drag it through the mud," I said, my voice completely devoid of the deference he had demanded from me for 30 years. "You only care about the optics. You only care about protecting the illusion you built, because you are too weak to face the reality of what your son has become." Elias opened his mouth, a desperate plea forming on his lips, but he never got the chance to speak. Grandpa Jeremiah lifted his silver-tipped walking cane and brought it down hard against the cobblestone. The sharp cracking sound made my father physically flinch. "Step aside," Elias Jeremiah commanded. The absolute authority in the old man's voice completely dismantled whatever remaining pastoral bravado my father possessed. "You have disgraced this family enough for one lifetime. Do not add public cowardice to your list of sins." My father shrank back, his broad shoulders curling inward as he yielded the path. I linked my arm firmly through Jeremiah's, and together we walked past Elias without a second glance. We stepped through the towering oak doors of the Oakwood Country Club and entered a world built entirely on manufactured perfection. The grand ballroom was a glittering sensory overload of obscene wealth. Vivian had transformed the cavernous space into a floral wonderland. Thousands of white orchids and imported hydrangeas cascaded from the vaulted ceilings and spilled over the edges of the grand tables. A 50-piece orchestra played softly on a raised dais, providing a sophisticated soundtrack to the clinking of crystal champagne flutes. 300 of Atlanta's most powerful figures were scattered across the room. I saw city council members, superior court judges, and television executives, all dressed in their finest evening wear, laughing and exchanging pleasantries. My mother was in her element, floating through the crowd in a shimmering gold gown that must have cost a small fortune. Vivian was laughing brightly, touching arms and kissing cheeks, orchestrating the room with the practiced grace of a seasoned politician. Watching her, you would never suspect that she had humiliated herself on a church floor just 24 hours ago. You would never know that she was staring down total financial ruin. She was entirely committed to the performance banking, her very survival on the belief that if she acted like royalty, the city would continue to bow. Then my eyes locked onto Chloe. My sister-in-law was standing near the center of the room, surrounded by a circle of wealthy socialites. She was wearing a sleek black velvet gown, but it was the jewelry that made my blood run cold. Resting against her collarbone was a massive, brilliant cut diamond necklace. It was a spectacular piece of custom jewelry, the stones catching the chandelier light and scattering it in blinding flashes. I knew exactly how much a necklace like that cost. I also knew exactly where the money had come from. Chloe had stood in the Genesis Cathedral parking garage yesterday and screamed about Julian lying to her regarding his debts. She knew the funds were stolen. She knew the money had been siphoned directly from an outreach program meant for vulnerable teenagers. Yet here she was parading the spoils of my brother's wire fraud in front of the entire city. Her sheer, unadulterated hubris was sickening. She was smiling, sipping champagne, and accepting compliments on the diamonds bought with stolen tithes. I felt Jeremiah's arm tense slightly beneath my grip. He had spotted the necklace too. The patriarch of the Sterling family had built his empire by working 70-hour weeks, purchasing rundown properties in red-line districts, and slowly building a legitimate fortune through decades of grueling labor. Seeing his grandson's wife wearing stolen diamonds at a party funded by fraudulent credit was the ultimate desecration of everything he had worked for. We moved quietly toward the back of the ballroom, remaining in the shadows near the terrace doors. The guests were too absorbed in the lavish spectacle to notice the arrival of the family patriarch. We waited. We did not have to wait long. The orchestra abruptly stopped playing. The sudden silence rippled through the massive room, drawing the attention of the 300 guests toward the front stage. The sharp, distinct sound of a silver spoon tapping against a crystal champagne flute cut through the quiet. Julian stood at the center of the stage, bathed in a warm, golden spotlight. He looked the part of the perfect, triumphant heir. His bespoke tuxedo fit flawlessly. His hair was perfectly styled. He wore a bright, charismatic smile that reached from ear to ear. But from my vantage point at the back of the room, I could see the truth. I could see the slight tremor in the hand holding the glass. I could see the pale, clammy sheen of sweat on his forehead. Julian was terrified. He was a cornered rat playing his final desperate card. He looked out over the crowd, his eyes scanning the sea of faces, searching for the validation he needed to pull off this massive lie. He knew Victor Vance had called in his $4 million loan. He knew he had less than 48 hours before his house and cars were seized. He knew the FBI was currently tearing through his corporate office. This speech was his last chance to force Grandpa Jeremiah into a public corner, using the weight of the city's elite to extract a financial bailout. "Thank you all for coming tonight," Julian began, his voice projecting smoothly over the sound system. "We are gathered here to celebrate 40 incredible years of marriage between my parents, Elias and Vivian Sterling. They have been the pillars of our community, the spiritual leaders of our city, and the guiding lights of our family." A polite round of applause rippled through the ballroom. Vivian beamed from the front row, pressing a hand to her heart in a display of manufactured humility. "But tonight is about more than just looking back at a beautiful past," Julian continued, stepping out from behind the microphone stand to engage directly with the audience. "Tonight is about looking forward to a magnificent future. As many of you know, the Sterling family has always been committed to growth, to building a legacy that will stand the test of time. My grandfather, Jeremiah Sterling, laid the foundation for that legacy decades ago." Julian paused, flashing his signature arrogant smile. He raised his champagne glass slightly, preparing to drop the lie that would secure his survival. Tonight we do not just celebrate 40 years of marriage, Julian announced, his voice rising in volume, demanding the room's total attention. We celebrate the passing of the torch. It is my great honor to share with all of you that my grandfather and I have officially merged our assets. Sterling Logistics and the Sterling Real Estate Empire are now one unified corporate entity, and I am incredibly humbled to announce that I will be taking over as the Chief Executive Officer of the new Sterling Holdings. A collective gasp of surprise and excitement swept through the crowd. This was exactly the kind of massive business news the elite loved to gossip about. Julian's smile widened. He thought he had won. He thought he had successfully trapped the old man. He was wrong. The heavy rhythmic thud of a silver-tipped walking cane striking the hardwood floor echoed from the back of the ballroom. The sound was sharp, deliberate, and entirely commanding. The crowd turned toward the noise. As they saw Grandpa Jeremiah stepping out of the shadows, the sea of wealthy guests naturally instinctively parted. They created a wide, clear path leading directly from the back of the room to the front stage. Jeremiah did not rush. He walked with the slow, terrifying purpose of an executioner ascending the scaffold. I walked one step behind him, watching my brother's triumphant smile freeze and shatter into a million irreparable pieces. Julian's hand began to shake so violently that the champagne spilled over the rim of his crystal flute, dripping onto the stage floor. He stared at his grandfather in sheer, unadulterated horror. He had expected Jeremiah to stay seated at his assigned VIP table. He had expected the old man to smile and nod to avoid a public scene. Jeremiah reached the edge of the stage. He did not wait for an invitation. He ascended the 3 carpeted steps, his eyes locked entirely on his terrified grandson. Julian instinctively backed away, retreating until his shoulders hit the heavy velvet curtain behind the stage. Jeremiah stepped up to the center of the stage. He did not look at the crowd. He did not acknowledge the 300 powerful people staring up at him in stunned silence. He simply reached out and took the microphone right out of Julian's trembling hand. Jeremiah did not yank the microphone. He simply extended his large, weathered hand and took it easily, overpowering Julian's paralyzed, trembling grip. The sheer terrifying gravity of my grandfather commanded the grand ballroom before he even parted his lips. 300 of Atlanta's most powerful and influential citizens sat completely frozen in their gilded chairs. Waiters stood perfectly still along the perimeter, silver serving trays hovering in mid-air. The 50-piece orchestra behind the stage seemed to hold its collective breath. Jeremiah turned to face the sea of expectant faces. He did not look angry. He did not look humiliated. He looked like a towering ancient titan who had just discovered a rotting termite infestation in the foundation of his greatest monument and was now preparing to calmly, methodically fumigate the entire property. He tapped the steel mesh of the microphone once with his index finger. The sharp, heavy thump echoed aggressively through the massive ballroom, instantly silencing any remaining confused whispers from the back tables. When Jeremiah Sterling finally spoke, he did not yell. He did not need to raise his voice to project absolute authority. He spoke with a terrifying, unyielding calm that chilled the temperature of the entire ballroom. His voice was a slow, deep rumble that seemed to physically vibrate the crystal champagne flutes resting on the damask tablecloths. I have lived and worked in this city for 82 years. Jeremiah began, his voice carrying the heavy, undeniable weight of a self-made king. I built my first company with nothing but calloused hands and a bank loan that took me 5 years of constant rejection to secure. I built the Sterling Real Estate Empire on the absolute, uncompromising principle of unwavering integrity. When you do business with a Sterling, you get honesty, transparency, and a handshake that means substantially more than a binding legal contract. He paused, his sharp, dark eyes sweeping over the glittering crowd, silently daring any mayor, any judge, or any corporate CEO in the room to contradict him. No one moved a single muscle. My grandson Julian just told you all a very compelling, highly emotional story. Jeremiah continued, his tone, dropping an octave, turning the air in the room to solid ice. He told you about passing the torch to a new generation. He told you about a magnificent future and a grand, historic family merger. Jeremiah slowly turned his head to look over his right shoulder at Julian. My brother was completely pressed against the heavy velvet curtain at the back of the stage. His chest was heaving with rapid, shallow breaths. His eyes were wide with an animalistic cornered panic. He looked exactly like a terrified little boy who had just been caught setting the family home on fire. Julian is a phenomenal storyteller, Jeremiah stated, turning his attention back to the elite crowd. But that is exactly what his grand speech was. A fairy tale. A desperate, completely manufactured fairy tale designed to cover up a multitude of sins. A collective sharp intake of breath swept violently through the room. City council members exchanged deeply alarmed glances. Superior court judges shifted uncomfortably in their seats, suddenly realizing the legal implications of what was unfolding. This was not a playful family roast. This was a brutal public corporate execution broadcast live to the highest echelons of Southern society. There is no merger, Jeremiah declared, looking directly at the city's elite, his words striking the crowd like perfectly aimed artillery. There is no new unified corporate entity. And there is absolutely no succession for Julian Sterling. The silence that followed was completely deafening. It was the kind of absolute suffocating quiet that immediately precedes a devastating natural disaster. Down in the front row at the lavishly decorated VIP table, Elias had physically collapsed into his chair. My father had both of his hands pressed firmly against his face, his broad shoulders shaking violently as the reality of his own criminal complicity crashed down upon him. He knew exactly what was coming next. He knew that the empire he had tried to steal from his own father was being systematically incinerated right in front of his eyes. Effective at exactly 5 o'clock this afternoon. Jeremiah continued, his voice echoing relentlessly over the silent crowd. I legally dissolved the Sterling Logistics firm entirely. The ballroom erupted into a sudden frenzy of hushed, frantic whispers. Corporate moguls leaned entirely across their tables, their eyes wide with disbelief. Dissolving a 50-year-old highly profitable logistics company without warning was an unprecedented seismic event in the Atlanta business world. Julian tried to step forward, his mouth opening wide to protest, to beg to stop the massive public hemorrhage. Grandpa, please! Julian croaked, his voice cracking into a pitiful, high-pitched whine. Jeremiah did not even turn to look at him. He simply raised his free hand, executing a single commanding gesture that stopped Julian dead in his tracks. I dissolved the firm because it had been completely corrupted from the inside out, Jeremiah stated to the room, entirely ignoring my brother's whimpering. The executive leadership of Sterling Logistics engaged in catastrophic, unforgivable financial mismanagement. They utilized predatory lending to cover gambling debts. They forged executive signatures, and they completely violated the sacred trust of our vendors, our clients, and our family. I will not allow the Sterling name to be permanently attached to a sinking ship of toxic debt and corporate fraud. At the head table, Vivian Sterling was staring up at the stage with an expression of sheer, unadulterated horror. The flawless, shimmering gold designer gown she wore suddenly looked like a cheap, tragic costume. Her grand 40th anniversary gala, the prestigious event she had leveraged her absolute last dime to host, had transformed into the public slaughter of her golden child. Vivian slowly stood up. Her manicured hands were shaking so violently she could barely control her own movements. She reached out blindly, grasping the stem of her crystal champagne flute, as if trying to physically anchor herself to the high society reality she had so carefully constructed. She looked from Jeremiah to Julian, her mouth opening and closing in a silent, agonizing scream. The realization hit her with lethal force. The money was completely gone. The legacy was dead. The untouchable societal status she had murdered my character to protect was completely, permanently annihilated. Vivian's fingers went entirely numb. She dropped her champagne flute. The delicate crystal hit the polished hardwood floor and shattered into 1,000 glittering fragmented pieces. The sharp, explosive sound of the breaking glass echoed like a gunshot through the silent ballroom. It was the perfect, tragic punctuation to the total destruction of her manufactured empire. Vivian sank back heavily into her chair, her face burying itself in her hands, her theatrical composure completely shattered. A few yards away, Chloe was completely frozen in place. My sister-in-law was standing near the edge of the polished dance floor, her hand clutching the massive diamond necklace resting heavily against her collarbone. The diamonds that had sparkled with such arrogant, aggressive brilliance just moments ago suddenly looked heavy and suffocating. Chloe's eyes darted frantically around the room, watching the wealthy socialites who had just been complimenting her, now staring at her with unabashed pity and revulsion. She was wearing the direct evidence of her husband's fraud. She was draped in stolen charity money, and now the entire city knew it. Jeremiah did not flinch at the sound of the shattering crystal. He did not look down at Vivian. He kept his eyes locked firmly on the crowd, his posture straight, his presence radiating an unyielding, terrifying power. I have spent the last 12 hours working intimately with my legal team and my crisis management consultants to ensure that our legitimate vendors and honest employees are completely protected from the fallout of this corporate dissolution, Jeremiah announced. The sterling real estate empire remains completely secure, completely solvent, and entirely separate from the fraudulent criminal activities of the logistics firm. He paused, letting the heavy weight of his words settle over the executives and investors in the room. He was reassuring the financial markets, securing his own lifelong legacy, and completely severing the infected limb of his family tree in one brutal, masterful stroke. However, given the recent catastrophic failures of judgment within my immediate family, I have taken decisive permanent action regarding the future of the sterling assets, Jeremiah continued. He turned slightly, his sharp dark eyes searching the perimeter of the ballroom until he found me standing in the shadows near the terrace doors. I held my head high, my posture perfectly straight, meeting the gaze of the only man in this entire family who had ever truly respected my mind. I have liquidated all remaining liquid assets, all property deeds and all investment portfolios, Jeremiah declared, his voice ringing with absolute crushing finality. I have transferred every single remaining cent of the sterling fortune into an impenetrable, legally fortified blind trust. The room held its breath. Julian let out a choked, devastated sob, sliding slowly down the velvet curtain until he hit the stage floor, pulling his knees tightly to his chest in a display of total pathetic defeat. And this trust, Jeremiah concluded, his eyes locked firmly on mine. A faint, deeply proud smile touching the corners of his weathered mouth, is now solely and exclusively managed by my granddaughter Camille. A collective deafening gasp ripped through the grand ballroom, sweeping over the 300 assembled guests, like a sudden change in atmospheric pressure. The sheer magnitude of the announcement hit the crowd with physical force. Jeremiah Sterling, the untouchable titan of Atlanta real estate, had just publicly stripped his golden heir of absolutely everything and handed the keys to the entire kingdom to the daughter they had spent decades pushing into the shadows. The high society matrons, the city councilmen, and the corporate executives sat frozen in their gilded chairs, their champagne flutes hovering inches from their mouths. Julian's brain visibly short-circuited. The charismatic, confident facade he had worn onto the stage instantly melted away, leaving behind a frantic, hollow shell. His chest heaved with ragged breaths as the reality of his total disinheritance crashed over him. Driven by a blind, irrational panic, Julian lunged forward. He threw his hand out desperately, trying to grab the microphone back from his grandfather, operating under the delusional belief that if he could just control the audio, he could somehow reverse the narrative. Jeremiah did not even flinch. Moving with a swift, practiced agility that defied his 82 years, the patriarch simply pivoted on his heel, using his silver-tipped walking cane to anchor his weight. He stepped smoothly out of reach. Julian grasped nothing but empty air. The momentum of his failed lunge sent him stumbling awkwardly across the stage, his polished leather shoes slipping on the carpeted platform. He looked entirely pathetic, a spoiled child throwing a tantrum in a tailored tuxedo. Jeremiah turned his back on Julian, completely dismissing him, as if he were nothing more than a nuisance. He gripped the microphone, his dark eyes locking onto his son sitting paralyzed at the front table. Elias Sterling was a broken man. The former pastor was sweating so profusely that his stiff white collar was soaked through. Vivian sat beside him, completely catatonic, staring at the shattered remains of her crystal champagne flute scattered across the polished hardwood floor. They had spent their entire lives treating their family legacy as a personal piggy bank, and now the bill had arrived in front of the entire city. "Julian, your house is being foreclosed on tomorrow morning," Jeremiah announced into the microphone. His voice was a flat, clinical baritone that cut through the silence of the room like a scalpel. You leveraged a predatory $4 million mezzanine loan using fraudulent collateral. You lied to the bank, you lied to the federal government, and you lied to me. The blind trust managed by your sister now holds the master promissory notes to your entire pathetic existence. You have exactly zero equity to your name. The crowd erupted into a chaotic, buzzing murmur. Corporate moguls leaned entirely across their tables, their eyes wide with shock, as the full scope of Julian's financial crimes was laid bare. Jeremiah did not wait for the noise to die down. He leveled his terrifying gaze directly at my parents. Elias, Vivian Jeremiah said, projecting their names across the massive space. The board of directors at Genesis Cathedral has already frozen your accounts and locked you out of the executive suites pending the results of the ongoing federal embezzlement investigation. Vivian let out a sharp, choked gasp, her hands flying up to cover her mouth. Furthermore, Jeremiah continued, his voice absolutely devoid of a single ounce of paternal sympathy, your country club memberships have been canceled due to non-payment. The silence that followed that specific sentence was lethal. To be stripped of a membership at the Oakwood Country Club was the ultimate social execution in Atlanta. It meant you were financially insolvent. It meant you were a pariah. And to have it announced while standing inside the club's own grand ballroom was a level of humiliation from which no one could ever recover. I made a single phone call to the board of directors here this afternoon to inform them that the Sterling Family Trust would no longer be covering your exorbitant delinquent dues. Jeremiah stated, his tone carrying the heavy, unyielding power of a judge delivering a final verdict. You are currently trespassing at your own anniversary gala. This party is the last meal you will ever eat on my dime. The absolute crushing reality of his words finally shattered the last remaining fragments of Julian's sanity. My brother looked out at the sea of horrified faces. He saw the mayor whispering frantically to his security detail. He saw the Superior Court judges shaking their heads in disgust. He saw the end of his golden boy entitlement. And then his bloodshot eyes darted across the room and locked directly onto me. I was standing perfectly still by the terrace doors, my posture straight, my expression completely serene. I was the architect of his destruction, and he knew it. A primal, violent scream ripped its way out of Julian's throat. He completely lost his mind. He lunged off the raised stage, his arms flailing wildly as he launched himself into the air, aiming directly for me. The polished veneer of the corporate executive vanished entirely, replaced by a rabid, cornered animal seeking desperate physical revenge. Several women in the front row screamed in terror as Julian hit the polished dance floor, his momentum propelling him forward in a blind, furious sprint. He never made it past the second row of tables. 3 massive private security guardsmen, built like linebackers wearing tactical earpieces and dark tailored suits, materialized from the shadows of the ballroom with terrifying speed. They hit Julian with the combined force of a freight train. The impact was brutally loud, a heavy, sickening thud of bodies colliding against the hardwood floor. Julian crashed down hard, the wind violently knocked out of his lungs. Before he could even attempt to struggle, the guards had him completely immobilized. One guard drove a heavy knee directly into the center of Julian's spine, pinning him flat against the floor. The other 2 aggressively secured his arms, wrenching them behind his back with practiced mechanical efficiency. Absolute chaos instantly consumed the grand ballroom. The delicate, elegant illusion of the high society gala evaporated into sheer, unadulterated panic. Chairs screeched violently against the hardwood floor as 300 of Atlanta's most elite citizens scrambled to their feet. The high society guests, individuals who had spent their entire lives avoiding scandal, immediately shifted into survival mode. Nobody wanted to be in the same room as a federal embezzlement suspect when the authorities arrived. Nobody wanted to be photographed near the spectacular implosion of the Sterling family. The Whisper Network transformed into a chaotic roar. Men in expensive tuxedos grabbed their wives by the arm, abandoning plates of caviar and half-empty bottles of vintage champagne. The mayor and his security detail were the first to move, cutting a swift, determined path straight toward the grand exit doors. Real estate tycoons and media executives followed closely behind, rushing to distance themselves from the toxic fallout. The mass exodus was swift, brutal, and entirely merciless. In the center of the swirling chaos, standing just a few feet away from where Julian was pinned face down on the floor, Chloe remained completely paralyzed. My sister-in-law was staring down at her husband with an expression of pure, unadulterated horror. The flawless Southern Belle facade she had spent years cultivating was actively cracking and falling away piece by piece. She had married Julian for the status. She had married him for the access to the sterling fortune. She had believed she was securing a lifetime of luxury vehicles, exclusive gala invitations, and limitless credit lines. Instead, she was staring at a broke, soon-to-be indicted felon, writhing helplessly under the weight of 3 security guards. Chloe's hands began to shake. She slowly reached up her manicured fingers, brushing against the cold, heavy metal of the massive diamond necklace resting against her collarbone. She suddenly realized what I had told her the day before was entirely true. The diamonds were bought with stolen church funds. The FBI was going to seize the necklace. They were going to seize the Buckhead mansion, the leased cars, and every single asset tied to Julian's fraudulent accounts. She was going to be publicly dragged through a federal trial. She had absolutely nothing left. The security guards hauled Julian roughly to his feet, pulling him up by the shoulders of his ruined tuxedo jacket. His face was red and contorted with fury, his breathing ragged as he struggled uselessly against their iron grip. He looked up, his desperate eyes locking onto his wife, seeking some shred of comfort, some anchor in the middle of his total destruction. Chloe did not offer comfort. She offered a spectacular, devastating rejection. She reached behind her neck, her fingers aggressively tearing at the delicate clasp of the diamond necklace. She yanked the heavy piece of jewelry forward with such force that the metal chain snapped, leaving a bright red scratch across the back of her neck. She marched directly up to Julian, her eyes blazing with a toxic mixture of absolute betrayal and profound disgust. Chloe pulled her arm back and threw the heavy diamond necklace as hard as she physically could directly at Julian's chest. The brilliant cut stones struck his tuxedo shirt with a heavy, insulting thud before clattering uselessly onto the polished floor. "You told me we were untouchable," Chloe screamed. Her voice was shrill, completely devoid of its usual practiced elegance, cutting sharply through the ambient noise of the fleeing crowd. "You are pathetic." She did not wait for his response. She did not offer a second glance at the man she had sworn to build an empire with. Chloe simply turned on her designer heel and sprinted toward the grand exit doors, pushing her way through the chaotic crowd of departing guests. She ran out of the ballroom and out of his life, leaving Julian standing completely alone, pinned between security guards, surrounded by shattered glass and abandoned diamonds, a ruined king ruling over a completely empty room. Vivian Sterling hit the bottom of her meticulously crafted social hierarchy with a heavy, ungraceful thud. As Chloe sprinted out of the grand doors and the elite members of Atlanta society shoved each other out of the way to reach the valet stand, my mother physically gave out. She collapsed backward into one of the gilded ballroom chairs, her spine hitting the ornate wood with a sharp crack. Her flawless posture, drilled into her through decades of country club etiquette, completely dissolved. She slumped forward, gripping the edges of the table so hard her knuckles turned a sickly shade of white. There were no delicate, tragic tears for the matriarch of the Sterling family. Vivian was hyperventilating. She was drawing in rapid, shallow gasps of air that sounded like a suffocating engine. Real, ugly, unfiltered panic washed over her face, streaking her expensive mascara and ruining the flawless foundation she had spent hours applying. She watched her entire existence evaporate in real time. The high society matrons she had invited to witness her triumph were actively avoiding her gaze, holding the hems of their designer gowns off the floor as they practically ran toward the exits. No one stopped to offer her a tissue. No one leaned down to offer a comforting word. They looked at her as if she were carrying a highly contagious disease. In the brutal, unforgiving world of Atlanta's upper-crust poverty, and federal indictments were the only truly fatal illnesses, and Vivian had just been diagnosed with a terminal case. She stared at the shattered crystal champagne flute near her feet, the glittering shards reflecting the harsh, unforgiving light of her new reality. Her husband was locked out of his church. Her son was pinned to the floor by private security. Her bank accounts were frozen. The Buckhead estate, the centerpiece of her identity, would be seized by the bank at dawn. She was no longer Vivian Sterling, the untouchable socialite. She was the mother of a fraudster, the wife of an embezzler, and a woman who had just been publicly stripped of her country club membership. She buried her face in her trembling hands, letting out a raw, guttural wail that was entirely swallowed by the chaotic noise of the fleeing crowd. A few feet away, Elias stood completely paralyzed. My father was a statue carved from pure, unadulterated shock. He did not move to comfort his hyperventilating wife. He did not step forward to order the security guards off his son. He simply stood there, his arms hanging uselessly at his sides, his eyes wide and vacant. The man who had spent his entire life commanding megachurch congregations and directing the moral compass of thousands was utterly speechless. Elias was being forced to swallow the bitter, jagged pill of his own creation. He had spent his entire life enabling Julian. He had looked past the gambling. He had covered up the early margins of error. He had blindly co-signed the predatory loans, believing with every fiber of his being that his golden son, the male heir to the Sterling name, would somehow magically figure it out. He had believed that men like Julian were destined to rule, while women like me were destined to serve. His blind, arrogant faith in patriarchal succession had completely blinded him to the rot spreading through his own house. And now he was looking at the direct result of his parenting. Julian was thrashing on the polished hardwood floor, his cheek pressed firmly against the wood, his expensive tuxedo jacket torn at the shoulder seam. The golden boy was spitting curses, his face red and swollen, looking absolutely pathetic under the knee of a security guard who outweighed him by 100 pounds. Elias slowly dragged his gaze away from his disgraced son on the floor and looked up at the stage. He looked past Jeremiah, his eyes tracking through the dissipating crowd until they locked directly onto me. I stood near the terrace doors, my emerald green gown catching the ambient light, my expression completely serene. I was not gloating. I did not need to. The total catastrophic destruction of his legacy was doing all the talking for me. I held his gaze, watching the realization dawn in his bloodshot eyes. He realized that the daughter he had dismissed as a mere public relations consultant was the one holding the master key to his entire empire. Elias took a hesitant, shuffling step forward. His mouth opened, his lips trembling as he desperately searched for the right words to command me, to shame me, to force me back into my designated subservient role. But the authority was completely gone. He was hollowed out. He looked at me, the tears finally brimming in his eyes, and mouthed a single desperate word: "Please." It was a silent, pathetic surrender. It was a plea for mercy from a man who had never once shown me any. He was begging me to call off the dogs, to reverse the dissolution, to somehow piece his shattered reputation back together. I looked at my father with ice in my veins. The adrenaline had completely left my system, replaced by a cold, calculating calm. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. In the sudden vacuum of space created by the fleeing guests, my voice carried across the room with lethal clarity. "You asked me to protect the family name, Dad." I said, my words striking him with the force of a physical blow. "I did. I just excised the rot." Elias flinched violently, stepping backward as if he had been burned. His shoulders slumped, his chin dropping to his chest as the finality of my statement set in. There would be no rescue. There would be no quiet internal family settlement. I had surgically removed the cancer from the Sterling legacy, and he was part of the discarded tissue. I turned my back on my parents, completely dismissing them from my reality. I did not spare another glance for Julian, who was still struggling uselessly against the security guards. They were ghosts to me now, relics of a toxic past that I had successfully demolished. I walked smoothly toward the front of the stage, offering my arm to Grandpa Jeremiah. The patriarch of the Sterling family descended the 3 carpeted steps with deliberate, majestic grace. He did not look at Elias. He did not look at Vivian. He took my arm, his grip firm and steady, his posture radiating absolute authority. Together we turned and walked down the center aisle of the grand ballroom. The few remaining guests, the stragglers too shocked to run, immediately backed away. They flattened themselves against the floral arrangements and the abandoned tables, parting like the Red Sea to let us pass. They stared at us with a mixture of profound fear and undeniable respect. We walked through the wreckage of the Golden Gala, our footsteps echoing in sync, moving through the shattered remnants of my parents' delusion like royalty, exiting a conquered territory. We stepped through the towering oak doors of the Oakwood Country Club and walked out into the cool, crisp Atlanta night. The contrast between the stifling, perfume-choked air of the ballroom and the sharp, clean oxygen outside was physically jarring. I took a deep, grounding breath, feeling the tension permanently released from the muscles in my back. The grand circular driveway was a scene of controlled chaos. Valets were sprinting back and forth, frantically retrieving luxury vehicles for the panicked guests, desperate to flee the property. But beneath the squealing of tires and the slamming of car doors, a new sound was beginning to echo through the affluent neighborhood. It started as a faint, distant wail rising and falling in the night air. Within seconds, the sound multiplied, growing louder and more distinct. The high, piercing shriek of police sirens was cutting through the quiet suburban streets, rapidly approaching the country club gates. The federal authorities were arriving to collect Julian. The trap had entirely snapped shut. A sleek, immaculate black Maybach smoothly bypassed the frantic line of exiting vehicles, pulling up precisely to the curb where Jeremiah and I stood. The chauffeur immediately stepped out, opening the heavy rear door and standing at strict attention. Jeremiah stopped before getting into the car. He turned to face me, the ambient light from the grand portico illuminating the deep lines of his weathered face. For the first time in my entire life, I saw something in his sharp, dark eyes that had never been directed at me before. It was not just respect. It was profound, unadulterated pride. He leaned heavily on his silver-tipped cane, looking at me not as a granddaughter, but as a fellow Titan. "You built your own empire, Camille," Jeremiah said, his low, rumbling voice filled with quiet awe. "You mastered corporate law, you cornered the venture capital market, and you acquired your brother's debt without using a single cent of my money. You did all of this in the shadows while they were busy playing dress-up." He shook his head slowly, a genuine smile breaking through his stern facade. "You never needed my empire." I looked at the man who had built the sterling name from the ground up, feeling a profound sense of closure settle over my chest. The little girl who had spent her weekends reading corporate ledgers while her brother played golf had finally won the war. I smiled a sharp, genuinely triumphant expression and gestured gracefully toward the open door of the Maybach. "I did not need the money, Grandpa," I replied, my voice smooth and perfectly steady. "But taking out the trash, that was priceless." Jeremiah let out a deep, booming laugh that echoed into the night sky. It was a sound of pure victory. He stepped into the luxurious interior of the vehicle, and I slid in right behind him, the heavy door clicking shut instantly, sealing us inside a quiet, soundproof sanctuary. The chauffeur seamlessly navigated the Maybach away from the curb, pulling out into the sweeping driveway, just as the first wave of police cruisers breached the main gates. I leaned back against the plush, diamond-stitched leather, reaching forward to open the chilled compartment built into the center console. I retrieved 2 crystal flutes and a perfectly chilled bottle of vintage champagne, popping the cork with a quiet, satisfying sigh. I poured the golden liquid, handing a glass to my grandfather before raising my own. As the Maybach glided smoothly down the oak-lined driveway, I looked out the tinted window and caught my reflection in the side mirror. In the background, the flashing blue and red lights of a dozen police cruisers swarmed the grand entrance of the country club, violently illuminating the white columns. Officers were sprinting out of their vehicles, heading straight into the building to drag my brother out in handcuffs. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my champagne, savoring the crisp, expensive taste, and watched the burning ruins of my family's toxic legacy disappear entirely into the darkness behind me. True power does not come from inherited wealth or family approval. It comes from building your own independence and refusing to let toxic people dictate your worth. When those who should protect you choose to tear you down, instead, the most devastating revenge is simply walking away and thriving completely on your own terms. You must learn to become the sole architect of your own success, proving that your value is never tied to their validation. Please share your story below about escaping a toxic environment to build your own empire, and always remember to subscribe for more daily content.